Thank you so much for this invitation to the Gun Rights Policy Conference. My name is Jennifer Stuber, and I'm talking to you here from Seattle, Washington. And I'm the director and co-founder of an organization called Forefront Suicide Prevention that's based at the University of Washington. We're here today to talk about a very important initiative for all of you in the audience today. It's on how we are working collaboratively in the state of Washington to prevent suicide, and in particular, to prevent firearm suicide. So for the next 30 minutes, we'd really appreciate your attention because what you learn today may help you to save a life. I'm going to be co-presenting today with my colleagues, Dr. Jeffrey Sung and Mr. Brett Bass. They're in the corners up there. And let me just say a couple of words about them. Mr. Brett Bass is a firearm safety instructor, and he is also in the U.S. Marine Corps as a veteran, and he's also an employee of Forefront Suicide Prevention, and he leads the program you're going to hear more about today. And Dr. Sung, he's a psychiatrist in Seattle, and he's also a faculty member at the University of Washington. They're great guys, and I'm really happy to be presenting with them today. Next slide. So today what I'm going to be talking about is something that's very near and dear to my heart. It's the fact that suicide can ambush any one of us. And then Dr. Sung is going to talk about firearm-related suicide and in general why people consider and act on suicide and shatter some of the myths that are out there. And Dr. Bass, or Mr. Bass, doctor, he's so smart, he should be a doctor. Mr. Bass is going to be sharing information about our Safer Home Suicide Aware program. Next slide. So I have a couple of other introductions to make here this morning or this afternoon, whenever you're hearing this. That smiling little boy in the corner, that is my son, Jake Adler. He was 5 years old at the time that this photograph was taken. And that pensive little baby in my arms there, her name is Zoe Adler, and she was 1 year old at the time that this photo was taken. And of course, there's a much finer, slimmer version of myself in the photo. And then the gentleman standing next to me, his name is Matt Adler. He was my husband. And I say was because my husband, Matt Adler, died by suicide in 2011. So I wanted to share this story with you all today, not to pull at your heartstrings, although this story may pull at your heartstrings, but to really emphasize that I do the work that I do every single day because I believe that Matt's suicide, like many suicides, was preventable. And the fact is that as a public, as a population, we're not prepared to do what we can do, what we must do to save many, many lives every year by suicide in the US. Next slide. So here's where we're at now as a family, although we have a puppy. And so there's, sometimes we like to think about our puppy as the reincarnated Matt. But let me just share with you a little bit about my late husband, Matt. He was an attorney in a very prestigious law firm. And like many of us, you know, he started to become quite burned out in his work. And he was very, very worried about the state of the economy at the time that his depression and anxiety worsened. The economy was on a downswing and the recession was coming. And he was very, very worried about being able to bill hours. He had significant depression and anxiety that developed. And he started to feel incredible pain and hopelessness about his situation. His depression and his anxiety just wouldn't get better no matter what was tried. And he was very, very sleepless for a while as a result of all that he was going through. He had incredible insomnia. And he got somewhere along the lines, got the idea to end his life because he felt that he wasn't going to get any better. He also was very disconnected. I mean, he took a leave of absence from his job at the recommendation of the HR department at his firm, which that was his whole life, right? His identity was to be a lawyer. In fact, he said to me one time, "Who wants a lawyer with a broken brain?" And so after, he took that leave of absence. So he was very disconnected. And then me not really understanding what was going on for him with his anxiety and depression and how severe it was, I was quite frustrated with him, right, in our marriage, because I felt like I was carrying most of the water for taking care of our 2 young children. And Matt was also being treated by doctors and mental health professionals. And I think the severity of Matt's situation was not well recognized. So Matt actually purchased, he went through a legal background check, and he purchased a firearm, and he went into a gun store, and he was able to pick up his firearm, and he used it within 4 hours after buying that firearm to end his life. So I tell you this story because all along the way, whether you're talking about, Matt's employer, myself, Matt's psychiatrist, Matt's psychologist, the gun shop owner, they were just the person who checked Matt into the hotel where he ultimately ended his life. All along the way, there were opportunities to stop the tragedy that happened to my family. And I believe that, we all can make a difference. And if just one of those things had been different, that Matt might still be here. I also want to say that Matt himself was not prepared for what to deal with when he became suicidal. He didn't have any awareness that this was something that could be happening to him or what he could do about it. And so it's all of us, not just those around us who are caring or concerned about someone at risk for suicide, but even those who aren't yet suicidal. We all need to understand what we can do to prevent suicide, because it could really happen. Well, we can really ambush any of us, as we said. Next slide. So I've really spent the better part of my time since 2011 working on the issue of suicide prevention. And how did I get interested in the issue of developing the Safer Home Suicide Aware program? Well, it really stemmed from the fact that here I was with a person in my own personal life who ended his life by firearm suicide. And I was quite stunned that I knew very little about the topic of suicide, about firearm suicide. And I was quite stunned that in the national discourse that you hear about gun violence, or even frankly the training that people receive around firearm safety, doesn't really ever talk about suicide. And that's quite astounding considering the story that I just told you, and the fact that that story is extremely common. We know that we now lose more Americans to suicide than we do to traffic fatalities, than we do to AIDS, it's one of the leading causes of death. It's the second leading cause of death amongst our young people, and fourth leading cause of death amongst our men in their middle years. So why are we not talking about this? And so I made a very open-hearted call to the National Rifle Association in 2016 to ask them why they weren't doing any training on suicide prevention, why it wasn't part of any of their magazines or marketing materials. And what I learned was that the NRA, like the rest of the American public, is really, really misinformed about the issue of suicide prevention. There's a lot of myths that drive our understanding of this issue. Those myths are things like, if someone wants to die by suicide, there's nothing you can do about it. Well, I can tell you, my late husband would very much like to be alive today. And I know that if he had had a different set of interventions, again, myself included, that I very much believe that he would have been alive and he would have been able to live the life that you see with my family, with our puppy. So NRA, very exciting. They are now very much excited about the work that is happening around Safer Home Suicide Aware, which we're going to tell you more about in a few minutes. Let me go on to the next slide. In the development of our program, there's this gentleman here. You might recognize him. I suspect you all do. His name is Alan Gottlieb, and he is the co-founder, or the founder of the Second Amendment Foundation, and he's really a hero to many across this country. And developing my friendship and relationship with Alan over this issue has been, one of the best experiences of my life. I think that Alan really came into this work with a very open heart about the fact that he and Julianne have both lost people to suicide, and they, like the rest of us, again, didn't really know what could be done about it. And so it's been this incredible opportunity for us to learn more And Alan has pointed out that in acting to prevent suicide, it will also help the firearms owning public to protect their Second Amendment rights. Because when people talk about gun violence and those large numbers associated with gun violence, they're largely talking about, we know that 2/3 of all firearm fatalities in the US are suicide. So when they're talking about gun violence, they're talking about suicide. So if we can rally around each other and do what we know we can do to prevent suicide, we can really take a big hit on those numbers and reduce suicides. So thank you, Alan, for joining with our work. And so Alan is the co-chair, next slide, of the Safer Home Suicide Aware program and campaign that now exists today in the state of Washington. And it is a diverse group of stakeholders, everyone from Alan and the NRA to ourselves at Forefront Suicide Prevention, to Sharpshooting Range, Veterans Affairs. Anyway, you can see the diverse list of stakeholders that are part of the Safer Home Suicide Aware program. And this group is about putting aside politics and really talking about solutions that we can all agree on that will reduce suicides. And in particular, our target audiences for our programming are men in the middle years and our veterans, who we know are at much higher risk for suicide. So at this point, I've just given you a bit of an introduction about how this work got started and about the range of partners associated with it. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Sung, who will be speaking to you about why suicide happens and a little bit about what we can do to prevent it.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen, and also a great thanks to Alan Gottlieb as well for giving us the chance to share some of the work that we do. As Jen mentioned, this is a chart that looks at the fatal firearm injuries in the United States. And so this is data from 2017. So some of the numbers change a little bit each year, but this gives you kind of a general sense. And what we can see is that homicide, so interpersonal violence and firearm fatality, is just over a third. Unintentional, so unintentional discharge, also other causes, so that might be legal intervention. So that's a very small proportion, that's about 3%. And so really what that leaves is about 2/3 of firearm-related fatalities in the US are suicides. And then you see some of the additional points down there. So these are looking at some of the other states where it shows what the proportion of suicide deaths are. And so in some of the states that have higher rates of suicide, you can see at the bottom, for example, Wyoming, 88% of the firearm-related fatalities are suicide deaths. So what I'd like to do is give kind of an overview of or better characterize the firearm-related suicides. And so in 2017, you can see at the top, there are about 24,000 deaths to suicide, firearm-related. And then on the left, this is the breakdown of male and female. So male firearm suicide accounts for about 86%, and then female, the smaller proportion at the bottom there. Male firearm suicide, typically white, and then typically adult, age 25 or older. And then if we look at some of the research looking at again, to better characterize who dies in firearm suicide, the first point here, the amount of time between the time someone purchased the handgun and then when it was used in a suicide by that person or someone in the household was about 11 years. And so typically it's not an immediate purchase. And then the second point here, the person would have passed a background check on the date of their death, about 92%. And so this is work that is being done out of Utah. So if Clark Aposhian is watching, some of the work is like super inspiring. So the majority of people who died by suicide in this Utah study, they would have passed the background check. And then the male firearm suicide decedents in Utah with a concealed firearms permit was about 23%. And so when we look at the demographics of firearm-related suicide in the United States, typically it's responsible gun owners, actually. So it's adult men with long-standing legal pre-existing firearm ownership. So the people who die in firearm suicides are people with legal firearm ownership. It's responsible gun owners. And so that's part of what motivates our work. Looking at then, so responsible gun ownership, protecting your home for all different kinds of firearm injuries And so the slide that we looked at before, there's really 3 different ways into the house. You're trying to secure the house from all kinds of firearm injuries. And the 3 different kinds are interpersonal violence, unintentional injury, and suicide. And so protecting your home from interpersonal violence, so that's the home defense, that's the concealed carry, that's defensive firearm ownership and defensive firearms use. And then protecting your home from unintentional injury prevention, that's Cooper's 4 rules, and that's safe firearms handling. And so really this question of how is it that fatal firearm injury is still getting into the house? And so the finding is that one of the doors is actually wide open. And so the suicide door is open. And then what we found, and so part of what Jen was saying, is that the door is being basically propped open with misinformation. And so some of the misinformation is most gun deaths are accidents, and we can see the majority of fatal firearm injuries are actually suicides. And then the idea that if someone really wants to kill themselves, there's nothing anyone can do to stop them. We've learned that it is possible to stop people from suicide. It's possible to stop yourself from suicide. And if they didn't have a gun, they'd just have found another way. What we find is that the means of suicide do matter. And so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the suicidal process and what it's like to go into the suicidal process and what it's like to come out of it as well. So I'll start with having life problems. And what I mean by life problems, and I should be clear that this doesn't mean that you were inconvenienced. And so these are, so sometimes we'll talk about veterans and post-traumatic stress disorder. And so sometimes the life problems, what I mean is that you've seen things that you can't unsee, or maybe you've done things that you can't undo, or maybe things have been done to you that can't be undone, or maybe it's you're about to be exposed for something that you've done. Maybe it's been arrested. Maybe it's the 3rd DUI charge. And so life problems tend to be high-level life problems. Life problems will then be followed by emotional distress. And so this could be depression, it could be anxiety, it could be alcohol use. And then what we find is that for the majority of people, the progress is for coping and problem solving. And so most people, if we say that the world is full of suffering, the world is also full of overcoming suffering. And so that's when we talk about getting a new sense of mission, getting a new sense of meaning, finding a new purpose, connecting with other people, and reconnecting with hope. And so then for a subset of people, not everyone, for a subset of people, out of that emotional distress, they start going down that road of suicide. And so this is the suicidal process. So one part of the suicidal process is what I'm going to call suicidal storylines. And so this is the story that the way that the mind interprets the information. So things have happened, I'm isolated, I'm alone, I'm worthless, I'm burdensome to other people, I'm hurting other people, and hopeless. And so these first 3 kind of come as a package: isolated and alone, worthless, burdensome, hopeless. And again, what I should say, it's not that these aren't true necessarily, because it's true that sometimes people have done burdensome things, and it's true that maybe you have been betrayed. The question is this the only thing that's going to be true about you forever and it will never change? Or the mind could interpret things and say that I am defeated, I am trapped. And so then the next thing that's going to happen is that the mind is going to shrink down. And so this is thinking everything is negative. Suicide is the escape from all of these problems. And so we'll describe suicidal processes. And if you've talked to people who've gone through this, people will say that it's almost like suicide is an intoxicating state. It's almost like it's hypnotic. It's almost like a craving. It's something that just comes into your mind, can't stop thinking about it. And so that's the tunnel vision of suicidal states. And then finally, it's going to turn into an action. So I call it motivated action. What is suicide going to do for someone? It's going to be emotion regulation. So it's going to put an end to the emotional pain. It's going to be problem solving. And so I don't have to face these problems in my life anymore. And then communication. It's going to send a message to other people. You don't have to worry about me anymore. And so there's going to be a storyline. The mind is going to shrink down, and then it's going to turn into an action. And again, the majority of people will find their way out of this. And if you've gone through these painful things in your life, this might be the pathway that leads you through. And we hear this all the time, that people make it through this, and then they have lessons that they've learned, and they have lessons that they can share with other people. And so the message that we have is that the suicidal crisis is not fatal in and of itself, that if you find a way to disarm the suicidal process, if you don't have access immediately to a lethal method of suicide, the vast majority of people get through it. The research shows that when people don't have the lethal method of suicide, they get through the suicidal crisis, they find a way to reconnect with life, they find their new mission. And so the term that comes up and that we use in the field is finding time and distance from a lethal method of suicide. And so the locking up firearms, limiting the ammunition, or finding a way to temporarily remove them from the house. And so what our message through our work with Alan is that we're looking for ways to respect the firearm, respect yourself, give yourself a chance to survive the suicidal crisis, find a way to reconnect with your mission, find a way to reconnect with a new sense of purpose, find a way to reconnect with other people. So what I'll do is turn it over to Brett. I gave you kind of a sense of what happens in suicidal states, and Brett's going to talk to you about some of the programming we do and some of the ways that what I've talked about might translate into actions that you can take.
Thanks, Jeff. So one of the things that we like to emphasize is that the techniques and procedures that we can use to help people while they're in this crisis are not new. President Abraham Lincoln, one of the most revered presidents in American history, was famously a person that struggled with depression and suicide. And on at least one occasion, his friends held onto all of his daggers, dirks, and pistols just to get him through that crisis. So this is something that we know has worked, and this is something that one of the most revered Americans in history has successfully used in order to get through this. So we want to let other people know that are in the community that these are things that they can do. So hold, transfer, call, these are some of the simple things. So when somebody's in crisis, we want to educate them that they're allowed to have somebody else hold onto their firearms temporarily. Temporary emergency transfers are something that we worked on here in Washington State. We'll briefly talk about that later. And then we want to provide them resources to things like the Crisis Prevention Lifeline, the text line. So if we move to the next slide, the way we've organized the Safer Homes program, which I manage for Forefront, is by looking at different layers of how we can help people. So one, we have an emphasis on individuals. So one of the things that the program does is we go to events, or at least we did prior to the coronavirus outbreak, and we would give people free locking equipment for medications and for firearms, and we would survey them about what they know about suicide risks and find out what they're doing about them and see if our program was helping. So we also look at relational experiences. So people that care about people that own firearms, right? So part of this is in training. We provide suicide prevention training to organizations like the Department of Veterans Affairs here in Washington State. We're even putting together a training package for medical and mental health providers so they can have better understanding for firearms and the people that own them, so that the conversations they might have with people are quite a bit more relevant and far less cringy than they might have been in the past. Of course, we've done these things at community events. So we want to go to places where gun owners actually go. We want to be part of those communities. We want to do outreach to them so that these resources are more available in more places. And we also do some work at the policy level so that we can perhaps remove burdens and barriers that could be in the way for helping people. So if we move to the next slide here, this is sort of an example of some of the things we've been doing. So on the one side, you can see this is a photograph of some of our wonderful volunteers that were actually at a gun show. The program is really unique. We've done one of, if not the largest studies of suicide knowledge of participants at gun shows. And so this is kind of the booth where we have the equipment. You can see that we have some of the gun safes on the table there. We have medication disposal kits and lock boxes for meds as well. On the other side, you can see the front page of a sort of abridged version of the revised Code of Washington that has to do specifically with firearms. And one of the neat things that we were able to accomplish through partnership with, in this case, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, if you'd opened that, previously there was a page that was labeled, this page has been left deliberately blank. And we were able to convince them like, hey, this is something we really care about. And you have a high emphasis of firearm safety. And point of fact, one of the things that the folks at the Department of Fish and Wildlife said is, one of the things that we've realized as a community is that every firearm mishap can be prevented, we approached them with a similar message. Said, listen, like, we've done a great job at reducing inadvertent firearm injuries. We want to do the same thing when it comes to suicide prevention. And so we were able to get them to put suicide prevention resources that our organization put together inside the pamphlet that comes with firearm purchases, and for those that complete hunter safety education in Washington State, and is also available to those that are getting concealed pistol licenses too. So that's some of the stuff that we've accomplished. We move on. We also have postcards that we distribute. So we can give these, and we do give these to federal firearm retailers, to firearms instruction schools and ranges. So these can be made available. So we have some education, because a lot of people just don't know that the majority of firearm deaths are suicides. And on the reverse side, which is the next slide here, we also have some of the information about recommendations. So make sure that unauthorized persons can't get at firearms, so that other members of your household that might be in crisis don't have immediate access to lethal means. We can't think of very many things that might be worse than a family member that's in crisis getting access to a firearm that you've chosen to be able to protect your family, and then having it used instead to take the life of somebody you care about, right? We also like to educate people that temporary emergency firearm transfers are lawful in Washington State. And on newer versions of this card, we have much more prominent versions of the crisis line number, which is in the corner here. We move to the next slide. This is kind of what this is going to look like in practice. So in addition to educating people about all these resources, we try to put together training materials to help both the public and members of the firearms industry get more proficient with this. So this is a quick video that we put together about how one of these interactions might look like in a retail setting.
Hi.
Good morning.
I'm Wayne.
Hi, Wayne.
How are you?
I'm good.
You know, my wife and I have been doing some research and talking a lot about getting our first handgun.
Awesome. So what kind of shooting experience do you both have?
Zero. We're both newbies. We're starting from ground zero on it,
Okay.
and just trying to figure out how to do it right.
Okay, the first step I would recommend you take is a training class. And that'll give you an opportunity to shoot a variety of different firearms and find something that you both like and that you're both comfortable with.
You know, some of the motivation for this is just sort of all the anger that's bubbled up in society, and road rage, and just that sort of extra safety measure for ourselves.
Have you given any thought to how you're going to store the firearm?
We have a couple of grandkids who are in that
Okay.
11, 12 area that I just want, they're curious, and I want to make sure that it's put to bed nicely.
And where kids are concerned, we know that accidents are at an all-time low, but something we don't often think about as suicide is not at an all-time low.
Really?
It is a very tragic number. Kids that age and teenagers tend to be a little impulsive. We know that teens tend to, if they choose a firearm, they tend to get it from a family member. So it's good that you're thinking about safe storage.
The idea of suicide is, we hadn't given that much thought, really.
But it's also important to remember that depression happens. So you need to be aware of how your wife is doing, and she needs to be aware of how you're doing. So it's really good that you're thinking about safe storage. This is a cable lock that'll ship with any gun you purchase, but they can easily be defeated. So it's not really the best choice when we're talking about suicide prevention and safety. This is a great option. It's made by Gun Vault. It has both options, a key override plus a keypad, and it's easy to store even a couple of guns in this. If you're really looking to buy a firearm, then it's important that part of your budget is for a safe storage device. It needs to go home with you the same day the gun goes home with you, so that you're in the habit of using it all the time.
So what are the next steps then if we decide we want to do this and make a final?
We do a background check, which is a 10-day waiting period in the state of Washington without a permit. And then as long as the background check cleared, we'd be able to transfer it to you.
Well, thank you. I'd like to see some examples
Okay.
besides what you've shown me so far.
All right, so this one, we're talking about external safety. Some have, some don't. This one actually.
This was a great project that we were able to put together. So big hat tip to both Robin Ball, who's one of our task force members and the owner of Sharpshooting Indoor Range over in Spokane, Washington, and West Coast Armory Indoor Range and Pro Shop in Bellevue, Washington, for allowing us to film there. So this is a great way to sort of show industry like, hey, these are how conversations along these lines can be organically part of your sales process. And it's a way to get new purchasers of firearms thinking about these things proactively. Because what we want to have happen is for the idea of suicide prevention to be just as much on people's radar as the idea of home and self-defense and the idea about mitigating the possibility of mishaps, right? So we want to do some cultural change as well as provide like practical physical items that we can help people with. That's kind of a snapshot of what we're doing with the Safer Homes program. At the policy level, something that we've done, and in my opinion, one of our crowning achievements was the temporary emergency transfer bill that we passed back in 2017. So by ballot initiative in Washington State a few years ago, the private transfer of firearms between individuals was made illegal. So all firearm transfers outside of immediate family and a couple of other very narrow exceptions had to go through licensed dealers. And an unintended consequence of this was that the clinical best practice for treating a suicidal patient who also had firearms, which is to have somebody else hold onto the firearms while the person's in crisis, was made debatably unlawful. As a result, we were able to get with the state legislature and a bunch of key stakeholders, such as the National Rifle Association, the Second Amendment Foundation, the other members of our task force, including, believe it or not, the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, and say, we need to come up with a compromise so that we can continue to do this. And we wound up with one. So we've passed this into statute. So in Washington State, it is now explicitly lawful per the statutes that says in the event that you're in a suicidal crisis, you can temporarily transfer a firearm so that you don't need to go through a licensed dealer to do that. So you're protected by the law to do the right thing at the right time for the right reasons so people can better help each other too. So that's kind of what we're about with the Safer Homes program. If you have—
Before you close it up, can I just add one thing?
Absolutely.
That'd be all right, because I see we have a couple more minutes left. I think one of the things that's been really unique and awesome about the approach in Washington State is that I want to underscore the fact that we've taken the approach that, yes, we all have a role that we can play in suicide prevention. And it's not just focused on the firearms owning public. It's not just focused on firearm retailers or to firearms folks. It's actually everybody. And so we mean that very seriously. Like, our work is also working a lot with pharmacies, focusing on the issues around medication safety, and also making sure that our healthcare professionals, we're the only state in the country that requires all healthcare professionals to have some basic training in suicide assessment, management, and treatment. So we truly believe that we all have a role to play and that this doesn't have to be a political and partisan issue. So I just wanted to make sure that got in there, Brett, as you close it out and tell people how they can learn more.
Yeah, so those are all great points, Jen. And if you have more questions about what we do and any of the trainings that we offer, you can either look at the broader Forefront Suicide Prevention website, which is intheforefront.org, or you can look at the Safer Homes program specifically, which is saferhomescoalition.org. We should have a roster of upcoming training events and things that we have that are published to that. One of the other small things that we've done is put together an online webinar that's just about firearm safety, and we've specifically geared this toward people who might be first-time purchasers. We know that with everything that's been going on in the world in 2020, an unprecedented number of first-time buyers have come around, and they've decided to pick up guns for the first time. And in some jurisdictions with the coronavirus shutdowns, they may not have the opportunity to get into a range to do some hands-on training. So we put together a firearms safety training course, and we're doing these quarterly at this point. So that's something else that you can check out. And if you have other questions, feel free to email me. My email address is bassb@uw.edu.
Everyone, and thanks everyone. Have a great day.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to the Second Amendment Foundation, and especially Julianne and Alan, for everything that you've done to promote and protect the Second Amendment and democracy in the U.S. and around the world. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for taking your very real time to join us in this virtual conference. My name is Rick Patterson. I'm the Executive Director of the Sporting Arms and Ammunition Manufacturers Institute, better known by our acronym SAMI. SAMRI was created in 1926 at the request of the U.S. government to create standards for safety, reliability, and interchangeability in the design, manufacture, transportation, storage, and use of firearms, ammunition, and components. But we also represent the industry and the firearms community in regulatory agencies throughout the world, up to and including the United Nations. I'd like to share with you one of my aha moments that happened quite a few years ago now. We were at a UN conference, and there was a blog done by one of the gun control civil society groups. And he was basically saying, hey, I've been watching Julianne and General Alan Youngman and myself, and he said, I've been watching these people, and they're intelligent, they're well-mannered, they're well-spoken, they're erudite. I kind of had to look that one up. But with all of that, how could they come to such radically different conclusions on the gun issue than we do? And they said, I've been watching them talk, reading their speeches, and what comes through time and again is this underlying, and these are his words, irresponsible sense of self. We are self-reliant. We protect ourselves. We put our own food on the table. And this was where he really drew that distinction. And that was that aha moment where I realized this is about, who do you trust? Do you trust institutions or do you trust individuals? As gun owners, we trust individuals. The gun control groups trust institutions. We believe the power should rest with the people. They believe the power should rest with the institution, with the government. It is democracy versus statism. So with that in mind, where does statism go with regulations and laws? And how does that happen? And what are the potential impacts? Well, and we only have to look at the European Union for an answer to that. Dr. Mauro Silvis gave an excellent presentation on the situation with marking of firearms parts in the EU. And while most of the world marks only the frame or receiver and uses that for the tracing, the EU has gone in a different direction, and they want to mark more parts. Now, marking a single part, marking that frame or receiver is easy. You have to understand, a lot of law enforcement and tracing people have no idea about firearms. They couldn't tell a Colt 1911 from a Smith & Wesson 86, but there's literally pictures that they can compare to, and okay, this is this make and model gun, and here, you know, with an arrow pointing to it, is the number, is the marking that is the serial number. It makes tracing efficient and accurate. When you start marking multiple parts on a firearm, how do you even identify what part that is for people that have no idea what a firearm is? You have exponentially increased the difficulty. You've increased the time it takes to do a trace. Even worse, you increase the opportunity for error. Time works to the benefit of the criminal. Errors work to the benefit of a defense attorney who can use those errors to put a violent criminal back on the streets. So why does the EU do that? It's about control. If marking and tracing of one part, if control of one part is good, hey, control of 3 or 4 parts is that much better. It's that unquenchable thirst for control that is a hallmark of any statist system. Perhaps even more troublesome is what's going on with the wetlands restriction that Dr. David Scallon described in his presentation. In that wetlands restriction, the European Commission, which describes itself as a college, they are not elected, they are virtually untouchable, but they make the laws and regulations in the EU. And they took the recommendation from ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, and they threw it away because it didn't fit their personal agenda. And they wrote their own proposed wetlands restriction. It's an unworkable system. The ECA Enforcement Forum looked at the EC's recommendation and the proposal they were putting forward, and they said this is not workable. When a member of parliament, an actual elected official, asked the EC about this, they said, oh, the forum's report supports our position. In fact, nothing was further from the truth. They're pushing their personal agenda. They're untouchable. There's no checks or balances. They have power. And what does power do? It corrupts. And they've gone a step further, because in their proposed regulation, they have taken REACH, which was intentionally passed as a foundation law to manage and regulate commerce, but in their implementation, they have expanded that to regulate individuals, giving the EC incredible amounts of power going forward. This is what happens when power is ceded to the government. How do countries get there? How do governments get there? In every case in the last 100 years, it's been through free elections. And it's a gradual process. It doesn't happen all at once overnight. It's step by step by step. It's taking that little bit of power and expanding it, as the EC is doing with the wetlands restriction. You look at what the National Socialist German Workers' Party did, and they won in free elections. They took over the media and education and law enforcement, and they manipulated and controlled the message. But they also silenced any opposition. In Eastern Europe, following World War II, the United Soviet Socialist Republic took over the media. They also took over education, law enforcement. They manipulated the message. They silenced opposition, and in free elections, got elected into power. They create the perception of a bandwagon. Hey, everybody's doing this. You know, this is the right thing to do. You don't want to be one of those people. You know, one U.S. official once called it the deplorables. You don't want to be one of them. You want to be one of us cool kids, don't you? No, actually, I want to be one of those free kids who can express my thoughts, my ideas peaceably, respectfully, without fear of the institution crashing down on top of me. They bully, they name call, they intimidate, they spread fear, they marginalize. And if your actions stand in the way and undermine their agenda, they will demonize you. They will do anything they can to silence anyone who isn't a fellow believer supporting their agenda. Now, I'm not going to get into the situation with the NRA. That's in the hands of the justice system. But I will say this about the timing of the lawsuit. It is timed to silence the single largest institutional voice supporting the Second Amendment. And you look at that timing and that idea, and it makes sense, because that would be a statist view, that the power rests in the institution. And if you silence the institution, you will have silenced the power. Well, that is so far from right, because, ladies and gentlemen, you and I are that power. It's the vast majority of the American public that supports the idea, the principles of private possession of firearms. It's the 140 plus million people with firearms in their homes to protect themselves, their families, their loved ones, to put food on the table or practice their chosen form of recreation. That's the power, but a statist doesn't understand that, and they go to silence the institution. The question then becomes, how do you succeed in this kind of an environment? And really often it's just about showing up and speaking up. A couple of examples. In 2016, the IUCN held a conference, and of the several hundred motions that they would be considering in that conference, one, motion 90, was to ban the use of all lead ammunition. We showed up. We spoke up. It was David Scallon and myself, and 8,000 people. And there were a few people that had supporting opinions. Some didn't feel like they were knowledgeable enough on the lead issue to speak up and step forward. Some were worried about damaging their careers and getting blacklisted for any future employment. So it was up to David and I to stand up, speak up, and push our agenda and push our message forward. And we did. And what resulted was many, 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 many hours of negotiations, long into the night, every night. And through an open and honest dialogue, we rewrote that entire motion, eliminated the reference to phase out of ammunition, and focused instead on science-based evaluation, population-based decision-making processes. And that's critical because what we stand for as hunters is keeping wildlife populations in balance with healthy ecosystems. The animal rights groups are just hey, hands off, let wildlife populations, expand beyond their ability to be supported by the environment, by their ecosystem. So that was critically important. But the bottom line is we just spoke up, and we were able to change the outcome to something that was a win-win. Everybody benefited from that, except of course the extremists. But sometimes a system will still silence you. And then you have to look at other means to win. And that happened in 2014 at the CMS. The CMS is a UN treaty, the Convention for the Conservation of Migratory Species. There are 135 parties to that convention. The United States is not one, but the EU member states are. We found out about it at the last minute that they were calling for adoption, mandatory implementation of guidelines to ban the use of lead ammunition. Now, we showed up. It was Mauro Silvas and David Scallon's predecessor at FACE and myself, and we tried to be heard. And we were silenced at every turn. At the side events where they talk about the different proposals, they would talk about, well, we banned lead in paint and gasoline, and so we have to ban lead in bullets and shot. And that's fundamentally scientifically wrong, and they know it. Banning a man-made liquid that is soluble is a whole different creature than the metallic lead used in paint or used in ammunition. And so they deliberately mislead to get to their agenda and succeed in their agenda. Of course, during the question and answer, we raise our hands, hey, and they stalled the question and answers until, oops, I'm sorry, we're out of time. Have a nice day. We were silenced. And there was nothing we could do about that. In the plenary session itself, we put our flag up to talk and weren't called on. Apologies from the chair later. Oh, I'm sorry, we just didn't see you. Of course, the chair had a personal agenda to ban lead ammunition. That was his personal opinion. They just silenced us. We were not going to get our message across. There was not going to be any dialogue. But fortunately, Mauro Silvas had established some very, very good working relationships with politicians in the EU, and he was able to call back to headquarters. He was able to get in touch with some of those politicians, tell them what was going on, and we were able to change the amendment to the CMS from a "you shall implement the guidelines to it is up to each member state whether or not they implement the guidelines. Sometimes it's really about being involved in the political process, knowing the right political people, having the right political people in office. So what can you do? With that in mind, and this being an election year, obviously get out and vote. Educate yourself. You know, the NSSF has their gun vote website. You know, educate yourself on the candidates, where they stand. Find the candidates that best represent your ideas and your ideals, and vote. Get active, know your legislators. Be vocal. Be an informed citizen. And whatever you do, don't be a jerk. You know, the opposition is looking for a reason to marginalize you and to ignore you. And if you're a jerk, you just gave it to them. What were the descriptors used by the UN blogger? Well-mannered, educated. Those are the keys. That makes a difference. Did that blogger turn around and go buy a gun? No. Did he change his views on gun control? I don't know. Kind of doubt it. But he looked at the world a little differently. And everybody wins from that. So with that in mind, I leave you with a couple of thoughts. Number one, never suppress or silence a fellow citizen who is peacefully expressing their thoughts and ideas. But at the same time, never ever let anyone silence or suppress you from peacefully expressing your ideas and your beliefs. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and I very much look forward to seeing you in person at next year's Gun Rights Policy Conference.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished members of the Second Amendment Foundation, my name is Mauro Silvis. I am the Secretary General of IACS, l'Istituto Européen des Armes Transport et Chasse, that is an umbrella association of the firearms manufacturers in Europe. I would like to thank Julian Wurst and Alan Gottlieb, that I know since years, for this kind invitation. I was asked to give a quick overview of the matters that we are facing in Europe under the industry point of view. First of all, I think it's useful to give a little bit a preamble of the differences between Europe and the US. I think most of us know them, but I would like to highlight that in the US you have a Second Amendment of the Constitution that protects individual to bear and firearms. In Europe, we have a different system. We have many rights, but we have also the right to ask institutions to have the permit to own firearms. And if you do not have any problems with the law and don't have any health issue, maybe you can have this permit. Moreover, I think it's important also to give a small description of Europe. As you might know, Europe was an economic community founded in 1957 and was formalized with the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. Therefore, we can say that the European Union was founded in 1992 and before with 12 member states, then 15, then raised. Last year we were 28, now with the Brexit we're 27. Anyway, today we represent 450 million citizens. It is important also to understand that the European institutions are created in order to have a dialogue under the political and legislative way between the European Commission, that is the executive engine of the proposal, legislative proposal. Then we have the council, that is every national member state is part of the council, so represents each of the 27 government, and the 704 members of the parliament. So this is a complex system on which we have to deal daily as a European association and as a national association. So the success of the good lobbying activity in Europe is based on good to have a relation between the European associations of the sector and a network with the national associations that work through the capitals. It's not easy, but in Europe we are trying with all the colleagues to create this system. Actually, let's say that the most important topics that we're facing in Europe are mainly two. The first one is the environment issue, that I understand that later on you will have a speech from a colleague expert on the issue of lead in ammunition. And the other ones, let's say that maybe you are very familiar with the Firearms Directive, that we had several amendments, the last one in 2017. Let's say as a system with all the European associations, we backed up a lot of problems and the restrictions since the request of amendment of this directive was not dictated by international treaty as usual, but by a political request that were the very sad terrorist attack in Paris, Brussels, and so on. But we can say that many things we pushed back. But I want to give you an example of the difficulty that we have to manage all the issues. One that we are still trying to fix and to manage is something that came out with the Firearms Directive, and it was the request in order to have more control of the firearms, of the circulation of the firearms, not understanding the difference between legal and illegal circuit, was the marking of the firearms. So at the beginning we had the chance, and we succeeded to have an initial proposal from the European Commission to mark only the frame and receiver of the firearms. So this from the European Commission perspective. Once that this dossier passes through the Council, so Member States representative, and the European Parliament, it became very difficult to manage. The aim was to have more control of the firearms, more tracing, and avoid, that was surprising, that people could buy spare parts here and there without marking and create an assembled firearm. Okay, after huge discussions, there was a very strong proposal from the Council to mark all the essential parts of an assembled firearm. Something that's crazy and useless. Through the Parliament we succeeded to remove such a request. Indeed, the Article 4 of this directive asked for the directive established that with respect to firearms manufactured or imported into the Union on or after September 2018, Member States shall ensure that any such firearm, or any essential component, placed in the market has to be marked, and so on. So, what does it mean? That politically we succeeded to remove this request to mark all the essential parts of an assembled firearm. And there was a political agreement of the Parliament and so on. This directive required also that the European Commission should establish some technical specification for the marking. And here's the surprise. We dealt for months with the European Commission in order to explain the problem, and they changed the interpretation of this article, and then they established that it was necessary to mark the firearm and its essential parts, so assembled. After a huge amount of discussion, the European Commission drafted a proposal that then was approved in order to have all these essential parts marked, not explaining well in which way, not giving some common standards for the member states, and all of this had to be implemented, transposed at national level within January 2020, so January of this year. The result is that many member states, when they had to implement and change the national law, didn't understand the meaning, the reason, how to do it. And the big problem is that in Europe you have a pillar of the European Constitution that is the free movement of goods within Europe, of goods and people. So if you do not give the standards that can be applied in all the member states, you cannot ask the marking of all the essential parts. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you appreciated this overview of the European situation. Please do not hesitate to contact me for any need, any question. If possible, I'll try to reply. Thank you, Julian and Alan, for the kind invitation. And at this point, I can say arrivederci from Rome. Have a nice day.
Hello and welcome to Windsor, England. My name's Andre Walker. I'm a talk radio presenter here in the United Kingdom and also a YouTuber. But actually, I'm here today to talk to you about the difference between gun law in the United Kingdom and the United States of America. And actually, I want you to take away a really important lesson, because Britain actually is a freedom-loving country. And yet the story I'm going to tell you should highlight the dangers of not having a constitutional right to bear arms in your system. And I also want you to know that in my own view, that whilst I'm not a gun owner, gun ownership is incredibly important in America, simply because it is a lesson about freedom. And when they attempt to take away one freedom and succeed, they come for more freedoms after that. We've seen that with the attempt to stymie free speech. But before I get into what I want to say and the story that I want to tell, I want to thank Alan Gottlieb and the Second Amendment Foundation for inviting me to speak. I think that freedom is an extremely important subject, and it is the #1 issue affecting the globe today. And we need to support campaigns in each other's countries to protect that. I know what a great help Alan and others were during the Brexit referendum in Britain, and I know how well respected they are in this country, and we have no greater friends than the United States of America. And so just as you assisted us with Brexit, I think we are keen to assist you in the right to bear arms. Admittedly, my video today is a tiny, tiny contribution, but I think nonetheless, the story is worth telling, and I hope that you will tell it to other people. So, before I got into journalism, I was Olympic researcher at London City Hall, advising the Conservative group. And that was during the period when we were applying to host the London 2012 Olympics. Now, there was a major problem, of course, with the bid document. Many of the shooting sports that were included in the Olympics are actually illegal in Britain. So whereas, forget the United States of America and the right to bear arms, in a country like France or in a country like Ireland, what is a legitimate sport will actually land you a significant prison sentence in the UK. Now, we have an organisation created by Royal Charter called the National Rifle Association of Britain, established in 1859. The NRA was cut out of the discussions as to what to do about the Olympics. And here is what happened in the end. Firstly, the National Rifle Association has a facility at Bisley, the National Shooting Centre. It is the home of British shooting as a sport, and really a hallowed territory that I hope some of you will be able to come to. But that was not chosen to host the Olympics. In fact, the Olympics instead was hosted at a purpose-built facility for shooting in Woolwich. And in order for it to happen in Britain, because there had been some talk about the sports happening in France or Ireland, they had to temporarily legalise the sports for the length of time of the Olympics. But as soon as the Olympics was over, they made those sports illegal again. And get this, demolished the shooting centre that they'd built at a cost of £50 million, which is what, $60 or $70 million. Demolished it. And that was because people were so hell-bent on being opposed to shooting that they were unwilling to allow a shooting centre to be part of the legacy of the London 2012 Olympics. And so British shooting didn't benefit from the competition. The sports that people enjoyed watching on television were made a criminal offence again, and we did not move forward. Britain is not a gun-owning society. I don't shoot, and most of my friends don't either. But actually, the sport of shooting is an incredibly important pastime for very many British people. And the attacks that you see from the political left, you know, these allegations that anybody that's interested in guns must be some sort of psychopath, we see that in Britain. And the problem is, of course, in Britain, and this is the lesson that the Second Amendment Foundation and Alan Gottlieb are pushing forward so strongly. Once they criminalise one element of shooting, they will just criminalise another, because this is an industry for them. These lobbyists don't go home when they win. They want the next win. And what starts with something that sounds incredibly modest and moderate in Britain ends with a criminal offence being created of enjoying the sport of shooting. The situation that we had with the Olympics left Britain out of pocket. It damaged our shooting industry, and I felt it was a national embarrassment. That is what we're fighting against, and you need to continue that fight. We are with you in that fight. Please spread this lesson from my country.
Hey folks, Sheriff Lamb out here in Arizona. Now, if you don't know much about me, what I do want you to know about me is that I love the Constitution, I love America, and I love freedom. And one of the things that protects those is the Second Amendment. Right now, we're seeing some things in our country that make the Second Amendment more relevant now than ever. And we've seen that with how many people have been out buying guns recently. There are so many new gun owners in this country. Now, one of the things that we've done here at our sheriff's office is we've created a citizens posse. Now, that's designed to bring our community and our agency a lot closer together. Give people an opportunity to understand what we do in law enforcement, how difficult this job is, and the good men and women that put on the badge every day. We want them to respect them. Now, one of the things that we do teach about, above and beyond like constitutional law and use of force and those types of things, we teach about gun safety, some basic nomenclature, some of the basic firearm safety rules, and really we emphasize how important it is that if you are going to carry a gun on a daily basis, which I completely support as a constitutional guy, that you get the proper training. So this message to all those new gun owners: thank you for joining the gun owning family, the Second Amendment loving family, and thank you for being willing to protect yourselves, your communities, and we recommend that you get as much training as possible. We're in some crazy times, folks. We are in some crazy times, and it's going to require a lot of strength and a lot of courage. We need now more than ever to be actively involved in the votes that we cast, not just on a federal level, not just for congressmen and senate and president, but on a local level. Last year, we had two very aggressive bills try to be passed here in Arizona, very anti-Second Amendment bills that would have seriously disrupted the beautiful constitutional carry state that Arizona is. And those were being put in play by local government officials. So I can't stress enough the importance of understanding who you are voting for your state legislature and state senator positions. Those are the people that are truly going to affect our ability and our continuing exercising of our Second Amendment rights. So please be actively engaged. This is actually a call to action to all the gun owners out there, especially to all you new gun owners, please be actively involved in supporting candidates who support the Constitution, who love and cherish freedom, who want this country to continue to be a country where we respect the rule of law. So my challenge to you and everybody listening to this today is, please get out and vote on November 3rd. I couldn't think of a more important vote in the history of this country than what we have coming up. I challenge you to take the time to get to know those people you're voting for and what they stand for, and especially, do they support and do they protect the Constitution? Because that's what we swear an oath to. I swore an oath to protect the Constitution of the United States, and I try to do that on a daily basis. And as a sheriff, you have my commitment that I will continue to uphold and defend and protect the Constitution of the United States, and that includes your Second Amendment rights. So all those gun owners, thank you, God bless, and God bless America.
Hi, Gun Rights Policy Conference Online Edition. We are really excited to be here. This is our first year being asked to speak, so we'll see if this happens again after we're done. But my name is Ashley Levinsky. I am the former Robert W. Woodruff Curator of the Cody Firearms Museum, and I was the project director on the full-scale renovation, and I am now in retirement as the Curator Emerita and Senior Firearms Scholar of the Cody Firearms Museum. I'm also a firearms history consultant for the Firearms Policy Coalition, as well as a lot of different TV shows, law firms, gun history related. If it exists, I'm probably working on it. And I have with me my, I was gonna say cohort, but partner in crime, I guess. I don't know. Yeah. Who are you?
I'm Danny Michael. I am now the Associate Curator of the Cody Firearms Museum, and Ashley and I was about to say worked together, but really we're still working together on the museum, and yeah, happy to be a part.
Yeah, so we were asked to talk a little bit about the importance of preserving firearms history, and we wanted to talk today a little bit about something that a lot of people don't know about, which is the role of museums in the United States and how firearms collections, kind of fit within that mold. So I guess we'll start a little bit on what the Cody Firearms Museum is, if you haven't heard about it. And if you haven't heard about it, shame on you. Shame. But the Cody Firearms Museum is, it just reopened last year. We did a $12 million renovation of it, so definitely come visit. We are open. We are open and have been open for a while now. But we've got about between 6,000 and 7,000 firearms in the collection. We interpret all of firearms history, which I always say good, bad, and indifferent. We start kind of in the, I guess we started in BC era, talking about the earliest evidence of crossbows, and we go all the way up through modern day. So we're still collecting contemporary pieces in the museum, and we interpret a little bit of everything. And the reason for that is that the collection always was very broad, but we are a part of a much larger organization. There's five total museums on the same property where the Cody Firearms Museum is. And so because of that, we get about 200,000 people through the doors every year. And about half of them are gun people like you who want to come see the Cody Firearms Museum. But surprisingly, about half of those people have never, had much of an interaction with firearms in their life. So we wanted to make sure that we had an overall kind of image on the museum. And Danny, do you want to talk a little bit about how we came to be, how we exist?
Yeah, the reason we have a firearms museum that is so large is really born out of a couple collections that came before us. So as Ashley mentioned, we have about 7,000 guns in the collection that span the entirety of firearms history. And those guns originally were, the core of the collection was the Winchester Arms collection. So Winchester as a company kept their own technical and reference collection. They did exhibit it as a museum, as an educational piece several times throughout their own history. We actually traced the roots of the collection all the way back to Oliver Winchester. We have a letter from him talking about his own gun collection from the 1870s. And then they collected up and, throughout their history, whatever they were building, what their competitors were building, what interesting and odd things their sales agents found when they traveled around the world. A number of their company employees were sort of collectors or interested in history themselves, people like T.C. Johnson and Edwin Pugsley. Eventually, Edwin Pugsley, who's one of the sort of most prominent 20th century American gun collectors, sold a big chunk of his collection to the company. And then that was all turned into a museum in New Haven at the factory. Eventually, that museum collection was sort of wrapped up and sent out on loan to the Center of the West, at the time the Buffalo Bill Historical Center. And then it was on loan to us for a number of years before it was gifted in the late 1980s. And we built a wing of the museum, or wing of the center, as the Cody Firearms Museum, just for this collection. And of course, it's grown and expanded since then, in terms of just the collection itself. So probably still about 2/3 of the collection is from that original Winchester gift, but it has a long date. And because Winchester was involved in so many things and so sort of aggressive about collecting, you know, you hear the name Winchester and you might think of the Model 70 or the 1873 or something like that. But, you know, during World War I and World War II, they were building all sorts of things, from, you know, the regular bolt action rifles to special projects and machine guns and all sorts of stuff. So they built and collected a very diverse range, and set us up really well to be a historic representation of firearms.
And the interesting thing about kind of the museum world is that we can reach so many different kinds of people. I mentioned that about half of our audience really hasn't had a lot of experience with firearms. And so when we rebuilt the museum, we wanted to do it in a way that was very inviting, no matter how you felt about guns. And that's because, you know, we try as hard as we can to be apolitical. You know, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. So, you know, we take an apolitical approach to firearms history, and we really created a place for dialogue. But there is something that we realized a couple of years ago is kind of an issue with gun museums in the United States. And that is the fact that as a non-government museum, which we are actually bound by all gun laws. So whether that's federal, state, local, we are bound by all the gun laws. Now, we're lucky that we're in Wyoming for that, but we did a little mental exercise a couple weeks ago for our podcast, History Unloaded, on are we the most banned museum in the United States? Do you want to explain that, Danny?
Yeah. So this was just this is sort of born out of a longer term discussion that Ashley and I have been having over the last few years, and talking with other museums and sort of about our own collection. You know, when you hear the phrase that we have to abide by all gun laws, you might not think that's a big deal, because surely there's some exception for museums in those laws. And we talk about this with museum professionals, we talk about it with the public, and now we're talking about it with you folks. And that's really not the case. I think there's one state level law that mentions museums, and it's not necessarily that they can collect whatever they want. It's more like they have an exemption to sort of showing their firearms. Like it's like a weird brandishing or concealed carry thing I don't know it off the top of my head, but it's not what you think it would be. And so when we say we abide by all these federal and state laws, like whatever affects an individual affects us as a private nonprofit museum, as an NGO. So when a collector can't go out and buy a post-86 machine gun, even though it might be a very interesting technical design, maybe move the field forward from a design standpoint, we have that same restriction too. When a collector can't keep granddad's machine gun that was found in the attic because granddad brought it back from the war and never bothered to register it, we can't register it.
And didn't bother to register it, but if they didn't do it during like the one amnesty period,
right,
post 1934, right. Yeah.
Right. If granddad maybe he didn't get the notice in the mail, you know, there were a lot of people that those amnesty announcements missed, and so if the gun was never registered, we're not allowed to take it as sort of a safe haven. All those.
Sorry, if I can pop in there, because there was this kind of gentleman's agreement, like understanding for a long time that museums that were non-government could have firearms on loan from police departments or government institutions that can have those unregistered NFA on what's called a Form 10, but that's actually not the case. If something is on a Form 10, it cannot be on display at a non-government museum. It can go to the Smithsonian, which is a government museum. It can go to any type of government entity, but it cannot be here. If it were here, it would have to be stored in a lock safe separately with a separate key that none of us have access to, except the police department. So that idea that you could just form tenant to a museum, which I heard a million times when I started my career, is really not true. And that's not what the law says. And we have taken a stance with the Cody Firearms Museum to follow what the law says and not just, your random ATF agent, because what if that ATF agent that said it was okay, isn't there anymore, and the new person doesn't, want to continue to abide by that. So we try to follow everything, and we have a person that does this and manages this full time, because it's not something that is acceptable. And that's kind of flies in the face of what a lot of people assume with firearms museums.
And so Ashley had mentioned, when to kind of kicked it over to me to talk about why we say we might be the most banned museum is because, as museum people, we're in a world where we talk to art museums and history museums and natural science museums, and all these different things. And, a lot of these museums will do controversial exhibits, and that could be a really edgy art exhibition or something else like that. And that'll get a lot of press as, should they have done this museum, or should they have done this exhibit? Should they have been allowed to do this? And there's lots of back and forth in the field. But we actually thought of it in terms of, it's always whether they should or shouldn't. It's never whether they could or could not. And for us, it's really a question of we cannot in a number of US states. So we sat down and with our non-lawyer reading of things, tried to come up with a list of states where there was some piece. So we did the mental exercise that we did is, if we were to load up the whole collection as is, make no changes to the collection and take it around the country on a tour, which states could we go to? Which ones couldn't we go to? Another way to think of it maybe is if they just teleported the whole museum to these different places. Should teleportation be invented?
Which would be badass, but yes.
And really what we found out is quite a few states we would have to get rid of stuff in the collection to be okay in some of those states. And some states, it's just a handful of items. We were pretty nitpicky with this exercise. But other states,
darn you, Alabama, and your hatred of cane guns.
Yeah. But some states, it's pretty extensive what we'd have to change in the collection. So yeah, and some of them are weird laws. Alabama had some weird writing about cane guns that made it unclear if we could have the cane guns that are in our collection, and those date back pretty far. Other states, it's a little bit more oddball. I think Wisconsin was one where, pistol caliber machine guns had a different level of rule than other machine guns. So regular machine guns from NFA standard in Wisconsin would have been okay, but these pistol caliber ones, maybe not. And of course, that means things like submachine guns from World War II are out of the question, which we have several. So, and then of course you get into states with magazine capacity issues and that kind of thing. And it was interesting to me in doing this research that a lot of the states where had some level of grandfathering for their magazines. I don't think we ran into any state that said, there might be one or two now, but that said any magazine over a certain limit, regardless of date. I think there may have been one or two. I can't quite remember now, but even after those grandfathering dates, like depending on how you read them, it was a magazine acquired after a certain date, like say 1994. And it wasn't necessarily if the magazine was made before or after, as I read it. So if we had been in that state and we've had magazines that are historic and modern acquired after those dates, then, what do we do with those? And it really started to get a little crazy. And like I said, we're not lawyers, so we had to make sense of all this. But
well, and the things that popped up that are kind of the biggest issues for firearms collections around the country when they go to a museum, NFA is obviously the National Firearms Act of 1934 is a big one. We have the licensing so that we can have registered National Firearms Act items, but a lot of places don't. But we can't, like we said earlier, accept unregistered NFA items. Another one that popped up a couple of years ago when we were doing a Glock exhibition was the Hughes Amendment on the 1986 Firearm Owners and Protection Act. And that one is, there are some things that we could do with like manufacturer's licenses and stuff, but for the most part, if it's a machine gun after 86, the law letter does not apply to us. We talked to the ATF about that, and they wish it did, but there's just nothing that they can do because of the specific type of wording. So that doesn't work for us. We learned magazine capacity could be a real issue for a lot of museums. And the kind of big fear in a lot of this is the fact that we know a lot about it, but like I said, we have a full-time person to manage it because it's so complicated. And a lot of museums don't realize that this is an issue. So they kind of assume they have an amnesty, just like what we found in talking to politicians through the DC project. I actually got to talk to a lot of Democrat and Republican politicians last summer about this. And it's fascinating because it's one of those things that is incredibly unknown to the public, but it's also something that I found to have a lot of bipartisan support to try to find some kind of amnesty that can exist for firearms museums in the United States. And there isn't, when there is a precedent set by it, because other countries like England have firearms museum licenses where no matter what is available on the civilian population, if it's a historically significant piece, then you can have it if you're an accredited museum. And so there are things there, but it was an interesting thing because if you don't like guns, then sure, send them to a museum because they can be preserved, we can learn from them, and they're off the streets. But if you do love guns, then it's just the continuation of interpreting firearms history and that really important understanding of how firearms have impacted American heritage. And so it's been kind of interesting to have that dialogue because even people who really don't like guns are shocked that this is a thing and are usually pretty open to having the dialogue about how we could go about fixing that.
Yeah, it seems, we mentioned all these things that impact us. And so I think surprisingly for me, NFA was the biggest one we found because often states have additional restrictions on which NFA categories are allowed in the state. So that was the big one. I think the next biggest one we'd run into would be, it would be a tie between the various magazine and so-called assault weapon restrictions. But for all these rules, like Ashley mentioned earlier, there was just sort of this gentleman's agreement understanding that museums were exempt. And that seemed to work for a long time, in a pre-internet age. But now, when everyone is so aware of the rules, and I think a lot of these times in museums that exemption mentality lived on. And so we find this really common among museum professionals to just assume they can have whatever they want, because that's often the case with other categories. So when you think about, in the art world, certain materials, things like ivories and other kinds of materials might become an issue, or eagle feathers or something like that. There are provisions within the rules that govern those for museums and entities to have these things, but that was never written into firearms rules. So we don't have those exemptions stated, but people assumed it. And so probably one of the biggest categories of NFA offenders in the country, in the US, are museum collections, like just a blanket statement. There are plenty of, I am positive there are plenty of guns sitting in museum vaults right now as we do this. We've worked hard to make sure ours are in compliance, but for museum professionals that by and large don't understand firearms laws, that might always not be the case. And not like they're trying to hide these things, they just don't realize that they have a contraband item sitting in storage right now.
And, we're not naive. We know that it's a complicated situation. And, like in England, they've got a firearms museum license, but they also have an accreditation process that can apply to a range of museums, where in the United States, our accreditation process is through the American Alliance of Museums. And while we are accredited, only 5% of all museums are accredited. So you quickly will run into the issue of, government museums can't take everything. And then if you start with the accreditation as what is a museum to avoid, Billy Bob's garage museum, which like I'd go to, but whatever, he might not invite me. We realize it's complicated, and we realize that a license, may not be the answer, but what we're trying to do is just kind of raise awareness that this is a problem for museums across the country. And especially as, people propose gun legislation, it impacts museums. And, we're trying to just educate the public. We're not trying to influence their opinions one way or the other. We really are just trying to provide a space for them to learn about history and have their own dialogue and then make their own conclusions. And so it's, one of those kind of forgotten or unintended consequences, I guess, of, the legal system. And so we just kind of want people to be aware of it. We could talk for days about this, but we, only have 15 to 20 minutes. So the other thing that I kind of wanted to wrap up with in the next minute or so is just also the fact that while museums often get forgotten when things are being passed, a lot of times I've noticed working on a lot of legal cases. I just wrote a declaration for the bump stock case. I wrote a declaration for the injunction against the California assault weapons ban, is how often history is forgotten in the gun rights community as a very valuable asset for them to kind of make their communications of their opinions known. A lot of times you see one or two things that get put into the dialogue, but there's so much within firearms history that you can pull from in order to kind of make your own conclusions and make your own arguments when talking to people. And so we would like people to just come and hang out at the museum and learn everything they can about firearms history, because if you can quote one or two things like the buckle gun or the belt and fusel, I can give you like 50 more that existed at the same time. And that only, helps to strengthen your understanding of firearms, but also to help really make the dialogue between people who love guns and people who hate guns something that's a lot more rich and understanding. And so I just think that don't forget about us when you're studying the history, because you may hear of one or two things all the time, but if there's one or two things, there's probably a lot more where that came from, and it's probably a lot more complicated than you realize. I made Danny speechless.
Yeah, that was such a good ending. I had nothing else. No, we're happy to be a part and be invited to share with you all. It's a really complex issue. We didn't even get this blueprint that's behind me here on the wall. As 3D printing and those blueprint things, that's a whole nother. We maintain a big archive of engineering drawings that we've digitized, and I'm pretty sure that in the not too distant future, some of the rules around that stuff will end up inadvertently touching on archives like that. So
don't even get us started about all the things that we had to learn about getting a 3D printed gun here when we didn't print it in-house, but we won't go there.
We won't go into all that stuff, but we could talk about this for a long, long time. It's a big issue, and it's, just from my personal experience, it's really tough to have to keep turning people down who have historic pieces that we cannot collect because nobody ever thought to write museums into the rules. So thanks for hearing us out.
Hopefully we can come back again.
Yep.
Hey, it's Senator Steve Daines in Montana, and welcome to the 35th Gun Rights Policy Conference. And on behalf of this proud gun-owning family, I want to say thank you. Thanks for being such great advocates of the Second Amendment and for protecting these very important freedoms that the Second Amendment represents. Now, let me tell you something. What we're facing in Washington, D.C. with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi's radical gun control agenda is astonishing. And unfortunately, it is the reality that we're up against. And my radical opponent, Steve Bullock, he's with them. And that's why this election in November is so critical. Because if we lose our majority in the United States Senate, we lose our check on Nancy Pelosi's radical gun-grabbing gun control agenda. And that means that her radical gun policies will sail right through Congress. So it's critical we re-elect fierce defenders of the Second Amendment this November. There is far too much to lose. It's an all-out attack on our freedoms and who we are as Americans. So with that, I encourage all of you to help wherever you can. And if you're able, visit stevedaines.com. It's stevedaines.com and chip in a few bucks. Fight for your rights. Fight for freedom. Fight for the Second Amendment. This is about re-electing freedom and I couldn't be prouder to stand with all of you in that great fight. So with that, please enjoy the rest of your conference and know that this U.S. Senator in Montana will never, ever waver on the Second Amendment, and I'll always have your backs. Enjoy the rest of your conference. Thanks so much, and God bless this great country, and may God bless each one of you.
It's a pleasure to get to be with you all today, virtually, to discuss the right that I believe is being threatened at this very moment by the liberal left. When our founding fathers decided to include the Second Amendment in our Bill of Rights, I doubt seriously they ever imagined that it would be under attack like it is today. Just recently, an extreme liberal special interest group, funded by Michael Bloomberg, spent $3.2 million buying up North Carolina's airwaves in an effort to defeat me. They want to replace me, a staunch defender of the Second Amendment, with my opponent, Cal Cunningham, who will be a rubber stamp for the radical left agenda. And you and I both know what that means. The first thing Cal Cunningham will do if he's elected is vote for whatever left-wing legislation the Democrats come up with to restrict the right to bear arms. I have an A+ rating from the NRA, and I will always fight to defend your Second Amendment rights. And my race isn't just about the individual differences that Cal Cunningham and I have when it comes to the Second Amendment policy. It's about making sure we keep the Senate in Republican hands. North Carolina has been dubbed by all the major election forecasters as the tipping point for the Senate majority. And my race will determine whether or not we turn the gavel over to Chuck Schumer. We already know how a Chuck Schumer-led Senate will impact our Second Amendment rights. He'll deploy the nuclear option and ram through Beto O'Rourke's plan to confiscate the guns of law-abiding citizens. And we just can't let that happen. That's why this election is so important. We need to fight back at the ballot box and protect our conservative majority in the Senate. We have to elect Second Amendment warriors like me who will fight for the right of law-abiding citizens to bear arms, because the alternative is someone who won't, and it's that simple. I want to thank you all for your courage and passion in this battle and give you my commitment to never stop fighting for the rights of every American. Together, we'll make sure Republicans up and down the ballot are successful this November and make sure that our Second Amendment freedoms are protected for years to come. Thank you, and God bless.
The idea that women should not have guns is not a new line of thinking, and unfortunately this antiquated notion can be found just about anywhere. I've experienced it personally countless times, and I'm sure just about every woman in this industry could say the same. In fact, in an encounter not too long ago, I got in a conversation, if you could even call it that, with a group about gun control. One of the participants in this verbal exchange was a guy who was against guns in the hands of anyone, and he was trying to break me down. After exhausting all the pointless arguments he could come up with, he exasperatedly threw this rhetorical question at me. What kind of a woman buys a gun anyway? I suppose in his mind he wanted me to be shocked and appalled by this statement. I'm supposing he wanted me to be taken aback. And I suppose in his imaginary world, the only women who purchase guns are vile, unruly she-devils or unrefined, power-hungry boneheads. His question really didn't faze me, however, and it certainly didn't offend me, because I know exactly the kind of woman who purchases a gun. I am one, and I'm certainly not alone. Gun sales and gun ownership continue to be on the rise for women. Data shows that concealed carry permits for women have skyrocketed over the last decade. And a poll from ABC News found that among the issues that millennial women care most about, gun rights were just as important as equal pay. So I say to this guy, and to all who will listen, you want to know what kind of woman buys a gun? It's the young graduate who just started her first real job in a new city 1,200 miles away. It's the retired businesswoman who wants to take up a new hobby that also offers the added benefit of self-protection. It's the wife who enjoys going to the range to shoot recreationally with her husband. It's the single mom who's been physically threatened before and who wants nothing but a better and a safer life for herself and her children. It's the family matriarch who acknowledges that evil exists in this world and that people need to be aware of themselves and their surroundings. I'll tell you about the women who buy guns. They're students, writers, homemakers, doctors, engineers, law enforcement officers, and administrators. They are innovators, visionaries, heroes, and survivors. What's more, the women who buy guns are strong, weak, old, young. They are experienced, novice, outspoken, soft-spoken, able-bodied, and wheelchair-bound. The women who buy guns are bold. They are determined. They are responsible. They are wise. They are wallflowers, and they are wildflowers, and they are willing to learn. Not only that, the kind of woman who buys a gun realizes that it's not enough that she alone understands how to safely and effectively use this tool for protection. She knows that it's important to train her family members. She also tells her friends. She helps her community. She spreads the word about our Second Amendment right, and she lives a responsibly armed lifestyle. That woman is your friend, your mother, your sister, your daughter. That woman is you, and she is me. I'm proud to be the kind of woman who buys a gun. Not everyone will understand that, and that's okay. Perhaps my actions will speak louder than my words. Perhaps people who know me, watch me, interact with me, or pass me by will see it for themselves. Not everyone will like the idea either. They may secretly hope that somehow women will just be left in the dark, unsure, unaware, anxious, and overcome, and they may never truly understand that the kind of woman who purchases a gun is the kind of woman who can be a role model and a positive influence, a woman who can make a difference and who can save lives.
Hi there, I'm Nikki Gosar. I'm the Executive Director of the Crime Prevention Research Center and author of Stalked and Defenseless: How Gun Control Helped My Stalker Murder My Husband in Front of Me. Back in 2009, my husband Ben was murdered right in front of me by a man who was stalking me. And because of Tennessee state law at the time, I had to leave my legal permitted firearm that I normally carried for self-defense locked inside my vehicle. Of course, the man who was stalking me did not have a permit to carry. He brought that gun into a gun-free zone illegally. And when I asked management to please remove him because I realized I was being stalked, they walked up to him, asked him to leave. He pulled a .45 from a shoulder holster under his jacket and shot my husband 7 times in front of everyone, in front of security cameras. When the police searched his vehicle that night, they found 2 more guns, ammunition, a baseball bat, binoculars, gloves, rope, and a knife. That's not a medical kit they found in his truck. I believe that man aimed to harm me as well. Of course, gun control laws are supposed to protect us, right? I believe they do the opposite. I believe when you put a sign on a business that says no guns allowed, the only people that would obey that law, obey that policy, obey that rule, whatever it is in the state you live, the only people that's going to obey that are good law-abiding people. Someone who is bent on harming others, that means nothing to them. The penalties for law-abiding people are very real. Good people don't want to lose their permit to carry. Do you think someone who is aiming to murder people in that business care? They're about to murder people. They don't care about a gun-free zone. All they care about is harming innocent people and probably getting a higher body bag count. And a lot of them just want the media attention. We've seen it time and time again on the news where horrible people go to these places to harm as many innocent people as they can. And the media gives them tons of attention, and that's what they want. It's sickening. We are at a point now where we've got to fight back. We've got to stand up for our rights. You know, I believe police are extremely important in helping fight crime, but even the police know they can't be anywhere and everywhere at any time. I was told that the police arrived that night within 3 minutes of the 911 call. That's extremely fast. But I can tell you that when it's happening to yourself or your loved one, it seems like an eternity. I don't want evil people to have the run over good people. We've got to be able to protect ourselves. A gun is the great equalizer, especially for women. Women are at a huge disadvantage physically. Let's face it, women are just not as strong as men in general. We've got to be able to protect ourselves. And that gun does that. You would think with so much talk in the media about violence against women, you would think the media would stand up and support a woman's choice in how she wants to protect herself. I believe the best way for women to protect themselves is to get the training, get a gun, get your permit, constitutional carry if your state allows it, but carry that gun to protect yourself. I don't want people to be paranoid, but I do want them to be prepared. Evil is out there, and unfortunately, it can pay you a visit. Thank you so much. Take care.
Hello, my name is Robin Sandoval. I'm honored to represent the female gun owner and to be part of a strong community of women who are passionate about our ability to protect ourselves, our freedom to train, and our right to bear arms. I serve as the executive director of a Girl and a Gun Women's Shooting League, which has more than 6,500 members across all 50 states and hosts training events at more than 200 ranges nationwide, including a ton of virtual events. I'm a certified pistol instructor, range safety officer, and armorer. I'm on the board of directors for the DC Project, and I'm the managing editor for Women and Guns magazine. I dedicate my life to teaching women how to protect themselves and their families. I'm a Second Amendment advocate, and when I meet with members of Congress, I tell them that the moms that make demands to take our rights don't speak for moms like me. I didn't always have this outlook. In fact, I was strongly anti-gun for most of my life. My paradigm was shattered by the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, when I witnessed a modern American city become debilitated overnight. It was a wake-up call of how quickly a community can fall apart. First responders were unable to respond, and families were left on their own. The moment that changed my life forever was when I saw a mother on the news hand her young children to a complete stranger getting on a bus out of New Orleans. The situation was so desperate at the Superdome, with limited food and water and increasing violence and death. This mom told her children she would try to find them in Houston in a few days. Oh, my heart shattered for her. I could not imagine her despair. And I resolved, that would never be me. Never be me. So at first, my plan was to have food and supplies so my family could shelter in place together if there was a crisis like Katrina. But my husband said, if people are desperate, that desperate, someone's going to kick in our door and take our food and water that you've stored for our kids. How are we going to stop them? And after arguing for gun control for years, I had no argument. From that moment of realization, I dedicated my life to learning the safe and proficient use of firearms and helping other families do the same. So far this year alone, a Girl and a Gun instructors have hosted 2,000 training events despite COVID that have stifled many activities. I've welcomed more than 3,000 women as members of a Girl and a Gun. Since January, I've appeared on dozens of TV shows and podcasts. I've written 75 firearms-related articles, and the book that I co-authored with my business partner Juliana Crowder and our director of training Tatiana Whitlock has sold hundreds of print copies and been downloaded thousands of times. This is just so far in 2020, and I'm not slowing down. There's so much work to do as new gun owners are seeking training and upcoming elections threaten our rights. As you know, this year has seen a surge of gun sales, and the NSSF reports that 40% of the sales were to first-time gun owners, and that 40% of first-time gun buyers were women. At A Girl and a Gun, we conducted a follow-up survey to specifically focus on women's reasons and interests. Results showed that 43% of women joined A Girl and a Gun to practice self-defense skills, In fact, 92% were in the process of obtaining or have already acquired their conceal or open carry permit. The survey verified that personal protection is the primary reason women are seeking firearms training. It went further to list specific reasons, including civil unrest and the fear of bans after upcoming elections. Many women had never even considered formal firearms training as an option before learning about opportunities with a girl and a gun. While all of the women who answered the survey were new to firearms training, the data showed that most were completely new to guns themselves. More than half, 52%, did not grow up with firearms in the home. A third had firearms in the home but had never learned to shoot, until now. The A Girl and a Gun community is doing it right. We have been living our mission for nearly 10 years, knowing that hearts and minds are not changed at the range, they're changed at the dinner table. Through our events, we are successful at bringing in thousands of women into the shooting industry. We create educated consumers and long-term participants in defensive training and competitive shooting sports. We offer a fun and enthusiastic atmosphere for women to learn about guns and to continue to grow their marksmanship skills. We have fully embraced virtual training and have the knowledge and resources to reach women wherever they are to give them the training and community that they're seeking. More importantly, we safeguard our lifestyle of gun ownership and preparedness and safety, where we proudly exercise our constitutional rights and preserve them for our children. Thank you.
Feminism, a term that has been heard throughout this country for years. A term that has brought movements and calls for progression and equality for women in the United States. Whether it be salary, job opportunities, the Me Too movement, or reproductive health. But the one topic that most feminists will fail to include in their rhetoric is the right for women to protect themselves. As a woman in a predominantly male profession that does not include the firearms industry, who was surrounded by boys growing up, I had never felt more powerless, more unequal, or less of a human being than I did when I was being emotionally and physically abused by somebody who told me they loved me. The feeling of being powerless, of being physically weaker than my abuser, knowing I physically could not stop him. He was bigger, he was stronger, he was quicker than me. Physically, he would always have that advantage. After I pulled myself up and managed to escape from the nightmare I was living, I began to reinvent myself, to take my life back, to once again be in control. This led me on the path that puts me here today. I realize there will always be someone who is bigger and stronger and quicker than me, but I will never let anyone be more prepared than me. Self-defense, situational awareness, self-protection. All of these things became clear to me as I progressed on my journey to take my life back. Knowing the red flags of personalities and relationships, being aware of my surroundings and the people around me. I began to focus on empowering myself instead of relying on others to do it for me. Firearms training and education helped give me that empowerment. Not because of the tool I now owned and possessed, but because of the knowledge, the mindset, and the skill set I now had. When I hear terms such as feminism, empowerment, and equality, I think of the ways that men and women are not equally empowered. And it leads me to the same conclusion of physical disadvantages. We can tell men not to harm women, and we do that. We can tell humans to respect others, and we do that. But the fact remains, evil will always exist. There will always be a potential threat. By continuing to lump movements like the Me Too movement and fighting for a woman's right to choose in her terms, by continuing to lump movements like the Me Too movement and fighting for a woman's right to choose in terms of her reproductive health into your fight for feminism, but fail to mention By continuing to lump movements like the Me Too movement and fighting for a woman's right to choose in terms of her reproductive health into your fight for feminism, but fail to mention the women's right to protect themselves, are you truly fighting for women to be equal? Are you truly fighting for a woman's right to choose how she protects her body and her life? Where I live, that choice has been taken from me. I am not given the option to protect myself outside of my home with my firearm. I am not given the option or the opportunity to protect myself from a potential assailant the way that I choose. Those rights have been denied to all law-abiding citizens in my city. So you leave most women with the physical disadvantage and then back it up with call 911. Don't go to the bathroom alone. Don't walk down. So you leave most women with the physical disadvantage and then back it up by saying, call 911. Don't go to the bathroom alone. Don't walk down a dark alley. Don't dress too revealing. Those are your answers. Your response is to make a woman fearful and to make her decisions based on the potential actions of somebody else, instead of encouraging women to empower themselves through education and tangible safety. I am a first responder in my city. More than anything, I understand the value and essence of minutes and seconds in a time of crisis. I respond to those calls. And as a first responder to the citizens of my city, I have chosen to be my own first responder. I refuse to rely on another person for help because the fact stands I may not get a chance to make that call for help. I refuse to be left powerless again, and I refuse to relinquish control. When you see women who fight for gun rights, you will hear us say gun rights are women's rights. They are. It is a physical equalizer. The knowledge and the skills empower us to be in control of our body and our life. We become the dominant in the situation. The level of preparedness and education gives us an advantage to the potential attacker. The training we go through helps give us the ability to recognize a potential threat before it becomes an actual threat. We are no longer a soft target. Women are not weak. We are strong, we are independent, and we are in control. I am a feminist, and gun rights are women's rights.
Hi everyone, my name is Diana Muller, and for those of you who were at GRPC last year, you might remember my impromptu practice speech of my opening statement to the House Judiciary Committee I was giving the following week. I just wanted to come back and give you an update and tell you a couple of stories from my experience on Capitol Hill. First of all, let me thank you and let me thank Julianne. Like I said, I was not scheduled to speak, and having watched Julianne keep everything running like a well-oiled machine, I didn't even believe it was possible for me to get squeezed in. But I felt it was important enough for me to get in front of you and practice my opening statement that I took a chance and asked my friend Amanda Suffolk to see what she could do to get me in. I really wanted your feedback, and you all seemed to like it, so that gave me such great confidence going into the hearing. I want to thank you. So here's my first story. I went to DC and had about 10 women from the DC Project, Women for Gun Rights, meet me there. We all knew that the red shirts of Moms Demand Action would be there. So we wanted to be seen as a counter visual and a counter voice to them. We picked the color teal and we used our Educate, Not Legislate t-shirt to make a statement from the gallery. Our ladies stood in line for several hours that morning and were able to be seated directly behind my seat. So anytime the camera was on me, they would be on the camera as well. It worked out great, and now the DC Project has a Teal for 2A campaign encouraging ladies from the Second Amendment community everywhere to wear teal to hearings, rallies, visiting their legislators, going to local festivals, or even the grocery store. Another highlight from the hearing was when I said I will not comply. Now, you all know that was not in the script. So let me tell you how it came to be. During the hearing, there was a disturbance in the gallery. I expected it to get squashed pretty quick, but it went on and on and on. And I finally turned around and I saw a man holding up a copy of the Constitution. He said that he wanted to testify, and I couldn't understand everything, but I saw his shirt says, "We will not comply." Fast forward about an hour, and I was asked a question, which led me to explain to Congress that they had already made me choose between being a felon or getting rid of my bump stock. So I wasn't trying to be rude, it's just my opinion that the bill they were discussing, the assault weapons ban, is unconstitutional given the Heller decision. I said, if you pass this, like that gentleman that was escorted out earlier, I will not comply. So all of that awesome content in my opening statement, and that's the only thing people heard. The police officer says she will not comply. And it landed me on Fox the next morning. So, anywho, it was a great privilege to represent our community, and we haven't heard a peep about that bill since, so I hope I contributed to that. Switching gears a little bit, I wanted to tell you another story related to my testimony. This one is my favorite because it highlights what kind of people we really are. When I came off that stage last year, I met Julianne and a couple of my DC Project girls in the lobby. I was thanking Julianne profusely, and I remember Robin Sandoval saying, "Well, what are you going to wear?" And I had a dress picked out, but the conversation was about how you should wear a solid color. And Robin pointed to Julianne's dress, and she's like hers. And if you recall, Julianne was wearing a pink 3/4 length sleeve dress. And this woman who did not know me 10 minutes prior says, "Do you want this dress?" And I said, "Oh, thank you. I don't think I can even fit into that dress." And Julianne says, "Oh, I think you can." And I'm like, "No, I think you're wrong." She's like, "I'm going to go upstairs and take it off right now." So she comes back several minutes later with not one dress, but two dresses, a pink one and a white one. And if you saw any of the videos from the hearing, you know I chose to wear the pink one. I wore the white one on Fox News the next morning. So we were both right. I did fit. It was just really tight, and I didn't get to eat anything, so I could actually breathe while I had it on. But this is a story of the epitome of someone giving a stranger the shirt off of their back, and I'm so proud to be a part of this community. As I close, I want to encourage each and every one of you to establish relationships with your legislators, every one of them from the federal all the way down to the school board. And possibly even more important, consider running for office. We have to take back the reins with constitutionally sound leaders. Run a voter registration in your neighborhood. Be brave and have one of those difficult conversations with your friends and neighbors about how important this election is to preserving our freedoms. Get out of your comfort zone, make a difference in your community to elect freedom. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you guys today, and until we meet again in person, here's a big old virtual hug.
Hi, I'm Amanda Suffolk from Eye on the Target Radio, nationally syndicated, female-hosted radio show. But that's not what I want to talk about. I really don't. I want to talk about electing freedom, but maybe modify it. How about selecting freedom? How about working for freedom? Because that is really what you are doing, I'm doing, we're all doing. And I want to talk about that a little more because last year I was the recipient of a t-shirt and it said, "I want to be like Amanda Suffolk." And my co-host Rob Campbell said, no, you really don't want to be like her because, man, it's confusing to live inside that head. But really, I want to be like a lot of you, and I think that's what motivates me, that's what drives me. There are so many features, so many things that each one of you does that I want to copy, I want to be like, I want to do. I want to mirror and mimic and bring it home to my community and to my state and to my people. And so what I want to talk about is I want to talk about how each one of you can look at the best in each one of us and then take it home and do something with it. Do it, carry it, and accomplish those things. We don't have to recreate the wheel because each one of us is doing some really cool wheelie stuff. So why don't we steal that wheel, borrow that wheel, and modify it to fit us and then use it. So really, think about it. How about in the world of, right now, Second Amendment stuff? There are so many organizations and they're all fighting with one another. Stop it. Just stop it. We need to band together. We need to work together. We need to prop each other up. We need to be like Robin Sandoval. Robin is the world's nicest person. And when you say, hey, Robin, can you give me a minute? Can you give me a hand? Can you give me some pointers? She will stop and she will do that. And I know she's probably the busiest person on the face of the earth, yet she'll still stop and do that. You know, you want to be like Rick Ector. He trained almost 2,000 brand new shooters this year. He had this dream, he had this vision, and he said, you know, if we introduce people to guns and we do it well, then they're going to be on our side. They're going to understand, they're going to see, they're going to work with those things, and maybe there's a life that's saved. Maybe there's a Second Amendment that is supported in my community because of it. So Rick Ector, and this year there was so many others of you guys that all went up there to help Rick Ector because he couldn't do it alone. There was all these instructors and all these people, and I saw some of them traveled 1,000 miles so they could be part of Rick Ector's team as he did those amazing things. This year, with the COVID and the lockdown, and then all the people buying guns, there's so much demand for training and education and knowledge that they just couldn't get to, that Rob Morris and Paul Lathrop put together they put together a series of videos. They put together 101 videos on guns and gun safety, and they reached out to a lot of you, and said, would you be involved? Would you be part of these video series so that we could educate people who can't get out, who can't get to an instructor? Those are the kind of things that we can do. We can copy, we can mirror, we can share, we can give a hand out and a hand up to other people. So really, when you look at it, I want to be like Robin Sandoval. I want to be like Rick Ector. I want to be like Rob Morris and Paul Lathrop. I can name another 100 of you that I want to copy, that I want to mirror, that I want to emulate, because together we make each other better. We do. But I can't end my video without doing a Betty White quote, because a couple years ago I did one that was maybe just a little off color, just a little off color. If you want to go back and look at that, I think it was 2 years ago. And so now Derek LeBlanc, who does so many really good things in Oregon, he would be so disappointed if I didn't quote Betty White. So Betty has to say this, and I think that this is a quote that really reflects the DC Project and the women of the DC Project, which I am very proud to be the Ohio rep for the DC Project. And Betty said, butterflies are like women. We may be pretty and delicate, but baby, we can fly through a hurricane. And can we? So together, dust off your wings and let's fly through this Second Amendment hurricane that we're living with right now.
Hey everybody, I'm Cheryl Todd from Gun Freedom Radio, and I am excited to be part of this historic virtual gun rights policy conference and talking to you on the topic of women and guns. You know, this topic goes far beyond simply the tools and training that's unique to the feminine physique. It is also about how women across the United States are interacting with their precious and unique American constitutional protections, specifically that are spelled out in our Second Amendment. Something that many people don't realize is that our nation is just now celebrating an important amendment-related anniversary. We are 100 years away from the passage of the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage, the right for females to walk into a voting booth and vote. In a nation that is over 240 years old, this right has only been available to us for 100 of those. And for most of us, it's difficult to imagine a time that there ever was a time when it would have been radical and even illegal for we ladies to simply vote. And no one handed us that right. It was fought for and hard won. Women seeking the right for representation through the ballot box were seen as divisive extremists. And it cost women friends and family, and some even went to jail. And once that right was secured, wouldn't you imagine that every single woman, daughters, wives, moms, and grandmas, would storm the doors of every single polling place and defend every single syllable of every single enumerated liberty that our founding fathers and mothers fought, bled, starved, and died to secure? But instead, too many of us have gone in exactly the opposite direction. Sadly, as we absent-mindedly drift past the 100th anniversary of this tremendous accomplishment, so many of our rights have been voted away by women. We have allowed politics, emotions, and outright lies to cause us to slip backward in our thinking, voting laws in piled on top of laws, separating us from our freedoms. And inexplicably, we independent-minded women find ourselves seeking permission from the very government we had to fight for even our most basic of rights, including the right to keep and bear arms, the right that protects our ability to protect our one and only God-breathed life and the lives of our families. We have somehow allowed politicians and groups like Moms Demand Some Unnamed Action to convince us that women aren't smart, strong, and capable enough to handle those big, scary tools. They want women to be delicate damsels in distress, just waiting for some big, strong government program to come along and save us. Well, thankfully, there are women countering that nonsense all across the nation and who are doing something and dedicating themselves to using all of our rights. Among these patriots are the women of the DC Project. And I am the proud Arizona delegate to the DC Project, which is an educational, nonpartisan initiative that brings women to Washington, D.C. and our own state capitals to establish relationships with our legislators and reveal the faces and stories of firearms owners and Second Amendment supporters. We help our legislators understand that education, not legislation, is the road to safer communities. And I am proud to report that Moms Demand hates what we are doing. The DC Project is carrying on the legacy of freedom begun by our foremothers of the women's suffrage movement, and our voices are unique, impactful, because we're using our history to protect our future. So, women and guns, because we women understand the important roles that we play in our families and in the power of our nation, our rights to vote and to defend our homes are forever joined together. And by our example, we teach our children and our children's children the values of showing up and speaking up, to use the 19th Amendment to protect the Second Amendment in this election season and in every season. Thank you. Thank you for your time and your attention. And now, go vote.
My name is Patrick Collins, and I've been involved in firearms for about 8 years and officially an instructor for about 5 years. I got into firearms when I moved down here to the South, only because the police response time to my house was about 45 minutes at the time. After my first experience, when I had to call the cops because of an incident that happened, I quickly realized that I needed to get a little bit more proficient with firearms. So I started taking lessons, and I wanted to become an instructor. I don't like being just a person with a firearm. I like to be the person with a firearm. I really enjoy teaching other people how to use firearms. For me, it is amazing. From first-time shooters to experienced shooters, you can always critique those that are using firearms. One of the most important things that I learned about using a firearm, not only is it a tool, but just the general concept of firearms scare people. And that's something that we need to break. You need to be adaptive and understand how to use it. It's not just a tool that you take out to stop a threat. It is also a way of life. Firearms have been in society for a very, very long time. To be able to defend yourself, it's very, very important. And that's why it's written in our Second Amendment. When I train first-time shooters, I always enjoy the anxiety and the pressure relief from when they pull that trigger. You can't put a finger on the idea of pulling a trigger for the first time. It's really an interesting experience. One thing that I want instructors to learn is not only should you be training, but you should be teaching. And not only should you be teaching, you should be learning. A lot of folks don't learn when they teach. And that's something I do every single time I go to the range with a new student. It's extremely important to constantly adjust your curriculum, your knowledge, your understanding. Every student is different. Instructors, what I want you to realize is that not everybody learns the same way. You need to teach and not preach. The students need to learn, not listen. Adjust your course curriculum. Think of it like a radio. You know what you want to say. You know what you want to do. But dial in to their frequency, not to yours. Be adaptive. Be accommodating. Realize that they are a different person and that half of them are actually afraid of firearms. As instructors, what we tend to forget is that a lot of people fail under the assertiveness of authority. When we train, we are teaching, but we also need to be students in listening. All of our efforts here are basically a commitment to better the community. So don't look at it as I'm teaching to have someone listen. Look at it as we are bettering our society. I've been a brand ambassador for about 8 years, and I realize that a lot of you guys have had a lot more experience than I have. But one of the things I have learned from teaching from all different walks of life is that not everybody learns the same. A lot of the first-time shooters are experiencing crime and uptick in violence in their communities. We need to be aware of that. They came to you for your help. First-time shooters are coming to you. They're coming to me to help protect themselves, their families, and their loved ones. There's a plethora of first-time shooters. They're young, they're old, they're secretaries, they're bosses, they're men, they're women, they're black, they're white, they're Hispanic, they're Asian, in all of the mix of the world. But here in America, it's our freedom. I decided to become an instructor when I realized that I can help people. I have taught many different types of folks from all around the country. I enjoy teaching. You'll never forget your first student, but you should never forget your last student. They are both one of the same. It's a constant learning process. You should enjoy teaching folks, enabling them to be able to shoot and defend themselves. My name is Patrick Collins, and I am an instructor for GA FASTA, Georgia Firearms Security Training Academy. And lastly, I want to thank the Second Amendment Foundation for the opportunity to speak at the Gun Rights Policy Convention. This is super important. This is important for everybody. Whether you're former military, a civilian, first-time shooter, we need to stand up for our rights.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Gun Rights Policy Conference being brought to you virtually because we can't be together due to COVID-19 complications. My name is Kevin Dixie, I am the owner and founder of No Other Choice Firearms Training. I am also a Second Amendment advocate. I'm a human rights advocate and a civil rights activist, if you will, and also the founder of the community outreach program called Aiming for the Truth, where we aim to get to the root causes of violence. We don't blame inanimate objects. We don't blame anything. We deal with the issues that are the true reasons that cause people to be violent, that being mental health, that being establishing families back together, teaching values, worth, equity, and things of that nature, and then having people understand that once we fix the root issues, we can then flourish as a community, thus as a country, thus as a world together. So it is great to be with you this afternoon or this morning, whenever you're watching this, or even if you're watching a replay. I'm glad to connect with you in some type of way. So I'm here to have a brief discussion with you regarding how do we convince or grow minority firearms ownership and also becoming involved in the rights. And I'm going to take a different turn than I normally do in this presentation. Normally we have a discussion about history and how history has established certain things that we don't want to repeat, right? Certain lessons we've learned, certain things that we've been through, whether you know or not, and we don't want to go back there. And we also want to understand that, yeah, truly, gun control is one of the worst things to ever not only just happen to the country, but when it comes to individuals with high melanin content, this country literally, before it was even founded as a country, had codes and things that prevented people from owning guns, especially Black people or African Americans, if you will, whatever you're comfortable with. Prevented them from owning guns due to uprising. Obviously, it's a way of controlling. And why would you want somebody you've been abusing for hundreds of years to now have the same access to the firearms and the ability to protect themselves as you do, right? There might be a little fear there. So we know that. I've explained that I have a series of guns called The Truth. The Truth is my signature firearm that is out there that actually details some of these instances that we've had throughout history that have led to the slaughter of people because they were unarmed or inadequately armed. And that is the same as being under control. And when you have inadequate arms, that is the illusion of freedom. It feels good, but it's actually not freedom. That's what we get when you say, hey, you can own this, but you can't own that, or you gotta have these limits on these things. So I talk about those things a lot. What I want to talk about today is the way that you grow the minority community in firearms is work on being more accepting of the minority community in firearms. And what I mean by that is this: we don't have to go out anymore and directly target certain communities. We just need to accept everybody. And what I mean by accepting them is, yes, you'll go out and let them know that you're available, but work on being available. Work on reaching out. You know, a lot of times, the only time that people interact with each other is when they're on the opposite side of an issue, right? So you get social media and you get these things, and that's when people start interacting, and it just drives a bigger wedge between the two, even if they have a lot of core things in common, right? So what I want to challenge everybody to do is actually go out, connect with someone, be kind to them. Now we are living in a social climate that is, it hit the tipping point, right? Well, be willing to listen to other people's viewpoints, because when we are trying to get people to understand freedom, how to protect themselves, we also have to remember, that we are the ambassadors of that message, right? So be kind in your approach. Don't just go spitting venom on social media or challenging people on their political views. That's going to be an error. Another tip I want to give individuals is don't discuss politics. When it comes to ownership and firearms ownership and the right of gun ownership, yes, it does have these things that come from these evil sources, right, that were political, right? There's no way around it. And the politicians that are trying to do those things now, that are trying to deprive us of our freedom and liberty under the guise of we've got your back, we understand that is absolutely a falsehood, and they absolutely don't have our best interest at heart. So, but I want you to avoid the discussion of politics in the form of Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Conservative, whatever have you. And here's the reason why, and then I'll let you go because I believe my time has expired. The reason that we don't want to get stuck doing that is because many people in communities like mine, we were, what I like to say, born democratic. And what that means is we were born into a certain political system, and there's such a small amount of us that actually escaped that mindset when you look at the big stats. So you don't want to attack something that somebody has known all their life, even if it hasn't worked in their benefit. Because once you start attacking it, they'll just start defending it, sometimes out of blind loyalty. It doesn't matter what it is if they feel attached to it. So just talk about them, who they are, what they're trying to protect, what their rights are. You don't have to get political with it. And when you bring up a politician, just simply say, well, hey, based off you wanting to defend your family, based off you wanting to be free, based off you having an issue with big government telling you what you can and cannot have, now I just want to talk to you about the people that you may be supporting that think opposite of you. So you don't want to become the individual that is bringing a good message, and then your message gets lost because people have a bias and are trying to defend what they've known all their life. And we see a lot of people doing that. They'll open up the conversation with saying, hey, I don't like X politician and this is why. And when you're addressing people, they're like, okay, that's great, but I thought we were talking about guns. I thought we were talking about freedom. So stick to that. And if you have to start bringing up the policies, that is absolutely fine. People should be politically aware of what's going on, but do everyone a favor. Stick to the policy. Discuss the policy, not left, not right, because no matter which way we look at it, there are people in every aspect of life, in every political party, in every career field that want to deprive us of our liberty and our freedom. So it's not even you're not even going to pass the purity test if they start challenging what the opposing party that they believe that you're protecting is, right? So then once you get to going through the purity test, we then lose focus. So those are the things I will tell you. Be kind, be open-hearted, listen to the social issues that are out there right now, because that's at the top of everybody's mind. We've had African Americans be the largest growing segment of gun owners in the year 2020 due to various reasons. That was already on the rise, but obviously 2020 came with its own complications. Thus, we have that positive consequence. So make sure that we don't push those people into hiding because politics can be venomous. Just talk to them and make sure that they understand that you value them and who they are, and you want to see them safe. Don't alienate somebody who could absolutely be an ally. Just be kind. So that's what I have for you. You can find me on all your social medias. You can just type in Kevin Dixie. My last name is spelled D as in dog, I-X-I-E. You can find me all over the place. If you want to find me on your social media, it's The Real NOC for no other choice. So please feel free to reach out. Feel free to engage. I look forward to interacting with all of you so we can push our freedom and our rights further in this country, and we can all sit down at the grand table one day and wipe our foreheads, know that we sweated this out, know that we've lost blood, but know that we've accomplished the mission. And listening to all of our voices collectively, I'm pretty sure that we have the formula to make that happen. We just have to stick together and make sure we do it. So this has been Kevin Dixie. I'm grateful to have been with you. I wish you all the best, and I'll talk to you soon.
Hi, I'm Rick Ector, and I'm here from Legally Armed in Detroit to talk about growing gun rights in LGBTQIA communities and in growing gun rights for women. I'm a gun rights advocate here in Detroit, Michigan, and empowering women has been my passion. Approximately 9 years ago, I saw a very disturbing story on my local TV newscast. It was a story in which a woman's naked and brutalized body was found on the street of the city of Detroit. And it disturbed me to the point that I thought that someone could or should do something about it. I felt sufficiently motivated to call upon fellow firearms trainers that I had a very good working relationship. And with the goal that we set, we made a plan to give 50 women in the Detroit area a free shooting lesson and to take them to the range and have them shoot at targets. That day was a great event. It was one in which I was filled with a lot of pride with what we were able to accomplish. Undaunted, I continued to grow the program. From that first year of 50, we grew to 100, and then to 200, 300, 400, we jumped to 6, 7, 8, and you know what? A couple of days ago, shall I say, a very short time ago, me and fellow firearms instructors from all over the country, we got together here in Metro Detroit, and we trained an astounding number of women. We gave over 1,600 women a free 1,900 women a free shooting lesson, and we gave them an opportunity to shoot at a gun range. It was a very historic day. To recent memory, no one knows if anyone has ever trained so many people in so short of a period of time. As such, a lot of people, particularly in the gun community, they've been reaching out to me. They want to know how can they duplicate the feat that we accomplished. Obviously, there are many people in the gun rights community who are looking out to spreading the word about gun rights and taking ownership for your personal safety in their respective communities. And to that end, I'd like to add that I have some advice as to how one could accomplish that. First and foremost, you have to realize that Rome truly was not built in a day. You're not going to go from 0 to 100 in an instantaneous fashion. It's going to take drive and commitment. You have to truly believe in what you're doing and that you can make a difference. And it's just sticking to it and staying the course. The other thing I want to add is that you can't do this by yourself. As independent as I like to think that I am, there's no way that I, one solitary person, could train so many people in such a short period of time. Accordingly, I needed help from a lot of people. So a question that may be coming to mind is, well, how do I find these like-minded people? And it's really simple. It may not be something that's very evident, but it's really simple. Just get started. Get started with what you have, get started with where you are, and get started with the people that you know. Unforeseen forces will conspire to bring your desires to fruition and make them happen. However, you have to be committed to the task. If we are truly committed to empowering women and other minorities in our communities with the gift of safety and personal protection, we will get started and we will do the heavy lifting. But by and large, just get started. If you start with just a handful of people, and eventually you get to a point where very soon you move to 50 people, 75 people, just keep going. It's worth it. We're going to empower people in our community, and we're going to make this world a safer place, one shooting lesson at a time. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Pallette, and the day after the 2016 Pulse Massacre, I founded Operation Blazing Sword, a nationwide charity designed to connect gun-curious queer people with friendly and non-judgmental gun owners who would teach them the basics of safe firearm operation and responsible gun ownership. In 2018, the Pink Pistols, America's oldest LGBTQ firearms organization, incorporated into Operation Blazing Sword, making me the head of the largest pro-gun, pro-queer group in the country. As you can imagine, this puts me in a very interesting place both culturally and politically. The far right loves my support of the Second Amendment, but hates that I'm gay and transgender, and the far left loves my queerness, but hates that I'm pro-gun. I catch a lot of flack from both sides for not supporting their version of freedom when, quite ironically, the position I haven't hurt anyone and my lifestyle doesn't affect you, so please leave me alone and let me be a queer gun owner in peace without passing laws against that, is, to my mind, the most freedom-centered position of them all. This year's theme is Elect Freedom. To be completely honest, I feel like I already covered this topic last GRPC when I told you that the best way to grow gun rights was to abandon your partisanship and become a single-issue activist, with that activism being the preservation of the Second Amendment and the expansion of firearm rights. If you haven't watched it yet, I hope that you will. For my speech this year, I'm going to do something slightly different and talk to you about how to retain freedom. Our country is currently experiencing unrest on a level not seen in my lifetime, and from my perspective here in late August 2020, it seems obvious that in a month the unrest will have increased and the division escalated. I sincerely hope that by the time you see this, peace and common sense will have prevailed and we will no longer be shooting each other in the streets, but I won't hold my breath waiting for that. 2020 has also heralded a veritable explosion of new gun owners. More guns have been bought in the past 8 months than in any other time since the FBI has kept track, with the biggest spikes happening in March and June. Not coincidentally, March is when we entered lockdown for COVID-19, and police departments in big cities told civilians that their responses to 911 would be delayed or even non-existent due to the virus, and June was the first full month of rioting after the death of George Floyd. I can assure you that these purchases were not all made by firearm owners, for exactly the same reason that those of us who specialize in emergency preparedness were not the ones buying toilet paper by the pallet. We already had ours. No, the vast majority of the new purchases were made by people who previously did not own a gun, but when faced with mounting evidence that they could soon be on their own and have to defend themselves, went out and bought a firearm for self-defense. These 7 million additional purchases were so remarkable that even Michael Bloomberg's The Trace was forced to write an article on firearm safety for its readers, although I imagine it was published with Bloomberg's nose wrinkled in disgust. And now, in the midst of this unprecedented uncertainty and these unprecedented firearms purchases, we have before us an unprecedented opportunity to do what I urged you to do last year. Reach out to these new gun owners and, instead of mocking them, welcome them into our ranks. As gun owners, they now have skin in the game when it comes to firearm prohibition, and I assure you that many, if not most of them, will be reluctant to turn in their guns to a government which has so visibly failed to protect them and so visibly failed to ensure domestic tranquility. These new gun owners didn't buy 7 million new firearms out of some newfound desire to exercise a previously neglected aspect of freedom. They bought these guns because they saw an imminent need for protection, and that inability to protect themselves and their families scared them. This is why I say that once someone is a gun owner, they are likely to become a gun voter. Firearms exist at a peculiar nexus of cheap enough for anyone to buy, and yet expensive enough that we fight tooth and nail to keep them. They are bound irrevocably into our history and our struggle for freedom, and yet are so controversial that we must have a constitutional amendment to protect them. And even then, governments large and small, city and county, state and federal, gnaw at that protection like termites at the foundation of our nation's house. You wish to retain freedom? Then retain these new gun owners as your comrades in literal arms. Welcome them into the community, include them in your activities, and teach them what they have to lose if our right to keep and bear arms is taken from us. This is the way. Will you show them?
I'm Tony Simon, and the Second Amendment wasn't important to me until I thought I was going to lose it. Growing up in the South, in southwestern Virginia on a farm, everyone had a firearm. It was just a part of our lives, and I never thought about it. First day of deer season, no one went to school because almost everyone was hunting deer. Shotgun racks in the back of pickup trucks were no big deal in the parking lot of the high school. I shot competitively in junior ROTC. No one thought anything about it. I joined the Marine Corps, and after I got out, did a few years there, I decided to move to New Jersey from Virginia. So I started making phone calls, and that was my first inkling that there were different laws in different states about everything to do with firearms. And the closer I got to my destination, which was New Jersey, the more ridiculous the rules got. And when the lady who answered the phone at the New Jersey State Police told me my firearm had to be unloaded, it had to be separated from my ammunition had to be locked up, and so did the gun in 2 separate locations, I started laughing because I really thought this woman was joking. She got offended. And that should have been my first indication that New Jersey was not the place I wanted to be a firearms owner. But what did I know? I was in my mid-20s, and the world was my oyster. So I moved up to New Jersey, and I found out how ridiculous the rules were up here, where I'm still at years later, and to the point that you could not touch a firearm in a gun store unless you had a firearms ID card issued to you by the state of New Jersey. I didn't know what that was. I'd never heard of it. But I was telling the people at the gun store, can I own a firearm? Like, I can walk in the store and buy a long arm in any state in America. But you're telling me I can't touch one here. And that's when they kind of explain how New Jersey is set up and the restrictions and the regulations placed on us. So I'd have to fast forward another 15, 20 years before I ever had a New Jersey firearms ID card and went through the hoops to require a pistol purchase permit. And it's exactly what you think it is, permission from the government to purchase a handgun. I went through all of that. I finally got a firearm in 2012 in New Jersey. And I took it to the range and I sucked at shooting my Ruger 1022. You could call it a group, and that would be being kind. It was the size of a pizza box. But luckily, a friend of mine was an NRA certified instructor. Sean from Black Bag Resources had just got his instructor certification at Gun for Hire Range in Woodland Park under Anthony Calandro. So he said, Tony, I'm hosting my very first class. You want to come? I was like, yeah, because I stink at shooting. So I went there, and within a few hours, I'd picked up on the fundamentals again. And of course, I passed the NRA certification, and I was really happy. But what made me ecstatic was 2 days later, I went to the range. I applied the fundamentals that I learned. And at 25 yards, I put 10 rounds in a group the size of a postage stamp. And the feeling I had right then was a feeling I wanted other people to have when they picked up a firearm. So I went to Gun for Hire myself, and I took the NRA training classes, rifle, pistol, shotgun, safety, range safety officer, became all of that. And I was on a mission to become the greatest firearms instructor in the world, because I was going to give everyone this feeling of accomplishment that I felt, and all the good things about shooting a firearm recreationally like I felt, and knowing that it's for self-defense like I grew up with. And then Sandy Hook happened. And that's when I found out what happens in New Jersey when a tragedy strikes. When anti-gun forces can actually use the law and legislation to strip your rights away. I was told by New Jersey Second Amendment groups that the New Jersey legislature had 76 different bills lined up the very next day after Sandy Hook. They said they have them on call. Anytime a tragedy happens, they see how many they can push through. And that's when I started my work at being a Second Amendment advocate. Sean and I sat down over that weekend, and it took about 5 hours to pen the letter that we were going to write to our legislators in New Jersey and nationally. And after we finished, I took it and posted, both of us actually posted it on every firearms related Second Amendment page. Anything we can find, we posted that letter telling anyone, if you want to write your legislators, this is what we did. Please take this and either copy and paste it or put it in your own words, but please write your legislators. And that began our first activism. After that, I testified in the New Jersey Assembly, where I was so nervous speaking to the politicians that I cannot tell you to this day what I said. I just have no idea what I said to them. I had a speech written out and I said it, but I can't remember it because I was that nervous. But by the time I went back and spoke in front of the Senate, I was very confident. It's our job as firearms owners, if we want to have this right to continue for other generations, it's our job to become ambassadors, activists, and advocates. We have to do this. And there's various ways to do it. There is no template. You don't have to do what I did, which was start the diversity shoot. I went to Anthony Colandro and I asked him if I could host events at his place introducing people of color to firearms and firearms legislation and how to become an activist. And that was 2015, February 2015, and I called it the African American Diversity Shoot. And my intention was to invite all people, but concentrate on people of color to get them to become advocates for their civil rights. And the funny thing was, I got tons of emails from white people asking if they can come. And I'm like, yes, you can. The reason it's called African American Diversity Shoot is because it's African American History Month. That's all. And 4 people showed up. We had a great time. We talked to them about New Jersey laws. We talked to them about how to get their paperwork and become firearms owners themselves. That started it. It's been going on every 2 months since 2015. And it's a fun event, and it's grown spectacularly. And I've traveled around the country recruiting people to help us, from the industry to individuals of many different backgrounds, races, whatever. They've helped us. And I've changed it from just talking to people of color to talking to anyone, regardless of their race, regardless of their gender, their sexuality, their political background. It's all about growing the Second Amendment and letting people see that gun owners aren't the negative media stereotype that they continually try to push. Now, with 2020 and the coronavirus, there have been a lot of new gun owners. And some veteran gun owners have been saying, hey, these new gun owners have to step it up and become politically active. Well, here's the sad part. Veteran gun owners haven't stepped up and become politically active. They haven't done what they could. And I wrote this on social media post a few days ago, and I just want to run through some things that anybody can do to become an advocate and an activist to the Second Amendment. 1, write and call your legislators. Don't just wait until a tragedy happens. Actually establish that relationship by writing and calling them and saying, hi, my name is Joe Smith. I'm in your district. And I'd really like it if you don't vote for any more gun control bills, because a lot of them are coming, and they usually come immediately after a tragedy. Because what I found out is gun owners don't call legislators. Anti-gun activists do. Many of them have never heard of us or from us. Another thing we can all do is share 2A activism information on your social media. It's free. Just post up what different organizations are doing to help fight the good fight, and make people in your circle of friends aware of those Second Amendment organizations. You don't have to do it every day, but you can do it once a month or once a week. It's just a thing. Get word out about 2A organizations. You can go to your city hall or town hall meetings. You don't have to go to the state capitol. You don't have to march on the Capitol of the United States, but you can go to your township's city hall meeting, because all politics are local. That's something else you as an individual can do. You can join or donate to Second Amendment advocacy groups that you agree with. You can give as little as $1. We can all use your help, including diversityshoot.com. But we can all use the money, because we're fighting the good fight, and it costs money to do a lot of the things we do. Another thing that is be an advocate, and you can actually take people to the range. Individuals, anyone you know, people in their circle of friends. It's fun. We have the easiest part. We have a fun thing that is also a right that we can introduce people to. So please do that. And finally, one of the things we can do, and I think this is one of the most important of all, is stop being a jerk. Not online, not attacking people for the brand name of firearm they get, or how much they spent on it, or even questions that you find are stupid because, well, you learned that as a child, or you've known that for 20 years. Look, just like when you got your first firearm and you ran to join every firearms forum on social media, so does the new gun owner. And sometimes they don't know. There's a 1911 versus Glock debate. They don't know about 45 versus 9mm. They have no clue the difference between an AR-15 and an AK-47 and what a shoulder thing that goes up is. It should be our job and our duty to help them learn this thing. If you want to be a jerk, please, there are closed forums that you can go into and just be jerks to each other. But please, on open forums, understand, sometimes the bravest person in their group of friends is them, and they're going to introduce you to a lot of other things. I'm Tony Simon. I'm from The Second Is For Everyone. I'm also from DiversityShoot.com and the 2A 4E podcast. Thank you. Have a good day.
Hi, I'm Nikki Stallard. Many of you know me from Pink Pistols. An LGBTQ gun rights group, our motto, armed gays don't get bashed. Still go with Pink Pistols, destiny has me moving on. So why am I here today? Simple. The GRPC theme this year is freedom and unity. Self-defense is a natural right. Regardless of who, what we are, all of us have the right to defend our lives. Truth is, we have more that unites us than divides us. We don't have to like each other, but unless we set aside petty differences and come together to defend each other's rights, our rights will be gone. A Second Amendment is far more than an individual right. It is also a citizen duty to defend our country from enemies both foreign and domestic. The government that we, the people, create was not granted the power to rule. It rather was given the privilege to serve. Our government was supposed to preserve, promote, and protect our rights. It was supposed to provide for a common defense, provide for the general welfare, preserve tranquility. A system of ordered liberty, the rule of law, a free republic. Today, government at all levels has been corrupted. Forces both in and outside government are working together to destroy our country. It isn't just the Second Amendment they want to destroy. It is everything. Rule of law, ordered liberty, our free republic. Americans are being silenced. The tech tyrants, the cancel culture, the left-wing mob have killed free speech. Their endgame is obvious. Replace our republic with a socialist democracy. A collectivist dystopia. Their endgame will change us from free citizens into dependent, docile, dumb, subjugated serfs. We'll be useful idiots until we are useless, then expendable. Do you want to be a useful idiot? An existence of no hope, no dreams, no purpose? Without freedom, there is no life, just existence. Freedom is more than a concept. Freedom is a gift from God. God gave us more than life. He gave us freedom so that we could pursue our destinies. Freedom is what allows us to develop our unique gifts, skills, and talents, to make our own choices, to find our purpose, to pursue our destinies, to make our dreams into our realities. Most humans are not free. Billions outside of our country would trade places with any one of us so that they could be free. Freedom isn't free, it's expensive. But compared to the alternative, it's priceless. Choices must be made. Will you stand up to the mob? Silence is consent. Silence is complicity. Silence is cowardice. Previous generations shed their blood for our freedoms. To honor both them and future generations, we can do no less. My question to you, what color is your blood? Mine is red, white, and blue. The time for action is now. All of us can do something. No longer can it be just a few. All of us need to step up. Few of us, regardless of how strong we are, can stand up to the mob. The mob is like a huge herd of cows. They just stampede through us. Right now, we are like herds of cats. We need to grow into coordinated, hungry lion packs. When we become lions, the mob becomes our lunch. November 3rd is critical. Imagine President Biden. How about President Harris? This is why failure is not an option. There are many tasks. Just pick something. Just do it. Everything helps. There are many groups that need help. Pick one. Pick many. Ask how you can help. Be a leader. Be a follower. Be a supporter. Just do something. Right now, we still have nonviolent means to save freedom. Our actions, our choices on November 3rd will determine if freedom lives or dies. It has been my honor to speak to all of you. Thank you. God bless.
To thank the Gottliebs for putting on the Gun Rights Policy Conference again this year. I'm sure in any year it takes a lot of effort for them to go and do that. But this year in particular, I'm sure has been even more trying than normal. I particularly appreciate the chance to talk to you this year because I believe there has never been as much at stake in terms of the future of private gun ownership. Those who dislike Donald Trump may think it's okay to let the Democrats run things for 4 years. Never-Trumpers might be fearful of the leftward lurch of the Democratic Party, but believe that they can always fix things 4 years later. That these are just the scare tactics we hear every 4 years. But things are different this time. Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and Senate Democrats are promising to eliminate the filibuster. This would radically transform the Senate. The filibuster may just seem like some arcane Senate rule that really, why should we care about it? But just to make sure everybody understands, filibusters allow senators to hold the floor as long as they want and thereby prevent legislation from being passed, at least until 50 or more senators vote to stop them. No party has 60 votes in the Senate, nor is any party likely to get close to 60 votes in the Senate. So legislation requires some bipartisan support. In the past, Democratic Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has talked approvingly of filibusters, saying that they're the cooling saucer of our politics that allow the nation bipartisanship, compromise, and progress. But if the filibuster ends, simple party line majorities will be able to pass bills. And the same party that controls both the House and the Senate will be able to zip legislation right through Congress. If Biden wins, there's a very good chance that he will pull the Senate with him. That makes the above scenario even likelier, especially considering that in the event of a 50-50 tie in the Senate, as election betting odds indicate is the most likely outcome right now, the vice president has the tie-breaking vote. If you want to have an idea of what's at stake in terms of legislation, you should read the Democrats' National Convention platform. You'll find things from licensing of guns to red flag laws to bans on different types of semi-automatic guns, a whole range of different types of regulations. I suppose one can also just look at the 10 or so gun control laws that zipped through the Virginia legislature this year when Democrats finally took control of both the House and the Senate in that state. But there's more at stake than just legislation. The courts themselves are also at great risk. One thing that Democrats will be able to do if they get rid of the filibuster is to change the number of judges on federal courts. People talk about the 53 circuit court judges that Donald Trump's been able to put on the circuit courts of this country. And that's been very important. But what you need to understand is he's just been able to bring the courts into rough political balance. Democrats still control the circuit courts for 24 states and the District of Columbia, which is considered the second most important court in the country. Republicans in 26. The problem is that the states the Democrats control the circuit courts for are the same ones that they tend to control the state legislatures or governorships. And the problem is that they then go and pass very restrictive types of gun control. And the Democrats who control the circuit court, such as the Ninth Circuit for California, or the circuit court governing states like New Jersey and New York, have approved any gun control laws that come through. Even if you're lucky enough to get a couple judges on a 3-panel decision to go with you, they then appeal the decision to the en banc, which basically means the entire circuit will vote on it. And since the Democrats strongly control the entire circuit, they go and they approve whatever legislation has gone through. The other problem is we haven't been able to depend upon the Supreme Court to go and rein in those circuit courts controlled by the Democrats. If you look at this last year, there were 10 cases that the Supreme Court was considering granting what they call cert to, which means a hearing. A couple of those had been around for a couple of years. You clearly had 4 Republican Supreme Court justices who wanted to go and hear those cases, and you had 4 Democrats who would have voted to reverse the Heller and McDonald decisions. That they clearly have indicated that they don't believe that there is an individual right to self-defense. The problem has been John Roberts, the Chief Justice. And from people that I've talked to who have been clerks on the Supreme Court, it seems clear to the Republican justices that if they go and were to bring one of these cases, and it only takes 4 justices to go and grant cert for these cases, John Roberts would go and vote the other way, just as he's voted the other way on a range of issues from religious freedom to DACA to Obamacare. And if he did that, that would create a horrible precedent. In fact, it could be used to make sure that any gun control law could get passed. What people have to realize is that the Heller and McDonald decisions, all they did was say that the government could not completely ban all guns or an entire category of guns, like all handguns or all rifles or all shotguns. That's not much of a restriction on government. And the problem that we face is that if the Heller and McDonald decisions are overturned, and as I say, there's 4 justices on the Supreme Court, they just need a 5th, you would be in a situation where governments around the country could go again and ban guns, either all guns or all handguns, for example. And if you want to go and see what the future is going to be like, one needs only look at a state like California, which has all sorts of gun control regulations, among them, for example, requiring that guns be able to microstamp a certain code on shell casings so that they can supposedly be identified if they're ever used in the commission of a crime. The problem is the notion that you can somehow use a firing pin to put a particular code marking on a shell is something that nobody's figured out how to do. If they do it, it's likely to be extremely costly if they do eventually figure it out, but nobody's figured it out yet. And the problem is that in some few years, possibly, or maybe a little bit more, handguns are going to be banned in California because of the different safety regulations and other regulations that are in effect. Guns have been grandfathered in, but when they go and make changes to guns, they lose that grandfathered in status. Well, if you have a Biden administration and the Ninth Circuit remains controlled by the Democrats, it seems pretty clear that any type of gun control regulation, including ones that end up banning all handguns, is going to get approved by the Ninth Circuit. You know, if you don't have the Supreme Court change, if you don't pick up one more vote so that John Roberts isn't the deciding vote on these issues, it's very likely then that that ruling by the Ninth Circuit would be the final say-so on what's going to happen. But Democrats can do more than that. They can go and with a simple party line vote, if the filibuster is ended, go and increase the number of judges on all sorts of circuits and create Democrat majorities on all the circuit courts across the entire country. At that point, your right to be able to own guns is going to be in real jeopardy, because if there's one issue that clearly separates Republican and Democrat judges, it's been the issue of whether or not people have an individual right to self-defense. Democratic judges, time after time, have indicated that they don't believe that that's the case. And if the Supreme Court ever provides a green light for them, they will be more than happy to go and rule that any type of gun control regulation, including bans, are perfectly justifiable. I'd like to spend a few minutes now just giving a brief overview of my new book, Gun Control Myths: How Politicians, the Media, and the Botched Studies Have Twisted the Facts on Gun Control. It's my 10th book, but I think it's probably my best in terms of the gun control debate that's coming up. I wrote it specifically for the issues that are coming up in this election, and to try to make it so that people would have a ready source of information to be able to go and educate others, just because what I've just been talking about in terms of the amount that's at risk. So I'm just going to go through and spend a few minutes talking about some of the myths that I think that exist there, and just maybe 5 of the 36 gun control myths that I go through in the book. One gun control myth that's very popular out there is that the United States is the worst country in the world in terms of mass public shootings. There are plenty of people who think that there are more mass public shootings, more at a higher rate per capita than there are in any other countries in the world. And I think so much of the gun control debate has been driven by these mass public shootings. I think the entire gun control debate would be dramatically different if just a few things were treated differently by the media. So, for example, one of the things that we frequently hear about when you have a mass public shooting is how did they obtain the gun, what type of gun that was used, information that's very frequently wrong in terms of the initial news stories. The one thing that I wish they would cover, that they just refuse to cover, and it's actually the simplest thing for them to go and find out about, is whether or not the attack occurred in a place where guns are banned. 94% of the mass public shootings in the United States have taken place in those areas where citizens were banned, civilians were banned from having guns for protection. At least for the successful mass public shooters. These guys may be crazy, but they're not stupid. Their goal is to try to go and kill as many people as possible. And they know if they go to a place where people aren't able to go and defend themselves, they're going to be a lot more successful in killing a lot of people. If even once in a while the media would mention we've had yet another mass public shooting where people were banned from having guns, I think would have a real impact on the debate. Another thing that I think would have a big impact on the debate is if the media once in a while covered those stories where mass public shootings were stopped by citizens with permanent concealed handguns. I have one chapter in Gun Control Myths where I look at mass public shootings, literally dozens over the last 5 years or so, where citizens with permanent concealed handguns have stopped what police have said would otherwise have been mass public shootings. There are literally dozens of these cases. And yet, if you look over that period of time, there's only a couple that got any real national news coverage. And the media botched both of those stories. But there's so many cases that you would think would have been obvious cases for national news coverage. Let me give you a couple examples. people remember the Pulse nightclub shooting. Well, a week after that, in South Carolina, at another nightclub, there was another mass public shooting that was attempted. There was a big difference between South Carolina and the Pulse nightclub shooting in Florida. Florida is one of 10 states that ban permitted concealed handguns in facilities that got more than 50% of their revenue from serving alcohol. South Carolina was one of the 40 states that allowed people to carry permitted concealed handguns in those places. In South Carolina, the attacker had shot 3 people. He was shooting at a 4th when that 4th person pulled out his permitted concealed handgun and seriously wounded the attacker. By contrast, in the Pulse nightclub shooting, at the time, it was by far the worst mass public shooting that we had had in the United States. There had been a uniformed guard there, but the problem that happens when you have these attacks, having a police officer there in uniform is an amazingly difficult job. These attackers have a real strategic advantage. They know that if they can go and kill or remove the one person who has a gun there, the one person who's in uniform, they're going to have free rein to go and shoot at other people. So the first person he went after was the off-duty police officer who was earning extra money being a guard there at the nightclub. And of course, we know what happened in terms of the large number of people who were killed. You know, take the Parkland school shooting. You know, most people won't know that just a few months later after that, there was an attack at an elementary school in Florida, not very far away from Parkland. But there was a difference. The attack occurred in a park. The school was having an outing. We had a couple hundred students that were there, as well as their parents. And the attacker came in, started firing his gun at people. But fortunately, there was a vendor there who had a permitted concealed handgun, and he was able to seriously wound the attacker. Again, the police said that if the vendor hadn't been there, a lot of people would have been killed. The thing is, in neither the South Carolina case or this elementary school attack in Florida did they get national news coverage. Again, my guess is the entire debate would be very different if once in a while those types of cases got coverage. But let me talk about the cases that did get coverage, because when the media covered them, they completely botched them. There's really, as I say, only 2 cases, and let me talk about one of them. People remember the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh. Just a few days after that, there was an attack at a Kroger grocery store in Louisville, Kentucky. An attacker had gone into the grocery store and had started shooting blacks. What got the national media attention was the quote where the attacker talked to one of the customers and said, "Whites don't shoot whites." The way it was reported on ABC, CBS, NBC, Meet the Press, other national news outlets was, here you had a white murderer assuring a white customer that the white customer had nothing to worry about because they were both whites. The problem was they missed the first part of the quote. If they had read the local media, and presumably some of them had, they would have seen the entire quote. The entire quote was, "Please don't shoot me. Whites don't shoot whites." Rather than the murderer assuring the customer that the customer had nothing to worry about, the customer had a permanent concealed handgun, and he was pointing the permanent concealed handgun at the murderer. The murderer was actually begging the customer not to shoot the murderer. In fact, they did exchange gunfire. The murderer was seriously wounded. He got into his car, drove about a mile down the road before he passed out, and the police were later able to go and apprehend him. You know, at the time, I was able to text back and forth with Chuck Todd, the moderator of Meet the Press. And in our social media kind of private messages exchanges, I said, look, I've just listened to your show. You spent maybe 5 minutes on this. And I think you missed a very important part of this. And I gave them links to local media, which had the entire quote there. And I said, maybe next week you can go and correct this, because I think it gives a different impression than what you were saying in a couple ways. One is, here you had a white coming to the aid of blacks, even though he had just been assured by the murderer that he had nothing to worry about. He had still risked his own safety to try to go and save others. That at least makes the story a little bit more complicated than simply a white racist going and killing blacks, because here you had a white who came to the aid of blacks. And also, of course, it makes the story more complicated from their side because it's an example of a permit concealed handgun holder stopping what otherwise would have been a mass public shooting. Again, if this had been given the correct news coverage, I think it would have made a difference in terms of the debate that's there. Surely in terms of issues of gun-free zones, which I think would do a lot to get rid of these mass public shootings. Now, on the issue of how people perceive attacks in the United States occurring relative to those in other countries, I can cut the media a little bit of slack, because I think it's understandable that attacks in the United States get a lot more news coverage than attacks in other countries. People remember, obviously, the mosque shooting in New Zealand. But what they probably don't know was within 24 hours of that, there was a big school shooting in Brazil, or there was a mass shooting that had occurred in the Netherlands. We just don't hear about a lot of the attacks that occur in other countries, even in developed countries, even in Europe. What you find is that the United States makes up about 1% of the world's mass public shooters, even though we make up almost 5% of the world population. So we're well below the world average in terms of the number of mass public shooters, or in terms of other things like the fatality rate from these attacks. France, for example, has a more fatality rate from mass public shootings that's about 111% higher per capita than the rate that we have in the United States. If you want to look at casualties from mass public shootings, during the 8 years of the Obama presidency, France had more casualties from mass public shootings in 1 year, 2015, than the United States had during the entire 8 years of the Obama presidency, 527. You had one attack in Paris in November 2015 at the concert there, where 130 people were killed. That's many more people killed, twice as many people killed as occurred even in the most deadly mass public shooting in the United States in Las Vegas. Few people know about these shootings or remember them, because even when they do get coverage in other countries, it's usually one quick mention and not more of a discussion after that. If you just compare Europe to the United States, not only do you have the Paris concert shooting, but you also have the 2011 Norway attack, where 67 people were killed, ignoring the people who died in the bombings that had occurred in Oslo. Again, that's more people killed in that one attack than you had die in either the Las Vegas attack or in the Pulse nightclub shooting that was there. Again, I think the entire debate would be very different if people realize that other countries around the world have much, much higher rates. If you look at the mortality from mass public shootings, you have countries like France, Russia, Norway, Finland, Switzerland have much higher rates of death per capita than we have in the United States. You have to adjust for population in order to make any type of comparison. In the United States, we have 330 million people. That's more than 5 times the population of France. There are other myths that I like to talk about briefly. One is the claim that you frequently see in the media that gun ownership is declining. It's one of the favorite things that are out there. You'll see headlines in the New York Times or other places that will emphasize that the number of people who own guns has been declining over time. And that's simply, I believe, extremely misleading and dependent upon them using primarily one particular poll or just selective results from other polls when they get unusual results. The one poll that the media loves to use is something called the General Social Survey. I'll just give you one story about this. Some years ago, I got a call from a producer at ABC News. They were doing a series on the dangers of guns in the home. And I talked to the producer for, I don't know, an hour and a half. And towards the end of the discussion, the producer was obviously getting very frustrated with me. I was trying to explain to her that I thought she was greatly exaggerating the risks of guns in the home. And finally, she said to me, she said, well, look, this isn't going to be much of an issue much longer. And I said, well, why do you say that? She said, well, gun ownership is disappearing in the United States. And I said, well, what are you referring to, the General Social Survey? And she said, yeah. And I said, well, I don't know if you know this, but your news organization, ABC News, together with the Washington Post, has its own survey. And your survey shows that gun ownership has been very constant over time in terms of the percentage of households that own guns, bouncing around any place from 46 to maybe 41 and back up to 47 or 48% of American households owning a gun. And she didn't believe me. So I offered to go and send her a link to her own survey, and I did, and she thanked me. Anyway, a few days later, ABC News came out with a really massive series on the dangers of guns in the home, where it was on Good Morning America, on the evening news broadcast, on Nightline, on a Wednesday, same things on a Thursday, on a Friday, the same three broadcasts, as well as 2020. And every time they talked about gun ownership, they only used the General Social Survey. They didn't even mention that they had their own survey that showed that gun ownership rates were fairly constant over time. And, whereas the GSS had shown it had fallen from about 50% of households to the low 30% range. And the reason why I think they selectively pick this one survey when there are many other surveys that don't show this drop over time is that they want to make gun owners feel isolated, that somehow the tide of history is going against you and that you're different or weird in some way and try to convince you not to own guns, to be like the vast majority of other people. As I say, if you look at a range of other surveys from Gallup to CNN to ABC to the Wall Street Journal to others, you see fairly constant gun ownership over time. And you look at things like the number of concealed handgun permits. In the late 1990s, you're talking about something around 2 million Americans having concealed handgun permit. Now it's about 19.5 million, plus the fact that you have 17 states which are either entirely or virtually all constitutional carry states, where you're not required to have a permit to be able to go and carry. And when states move to be these constitutional carry states, you see a drop in the rate of permits in those states because people only need a permit if they're going to go and travel, and they need to have some type of reciprocity recognized in other states. There are other data that I could go through that I go through in the book, but you get a rough idea of why I think that claim is misleading. Another claim that I think is very misleading and is used a lot in policy debates is the claim that guns allow people to kill themselves much more easily. And that if you only take away people's guns, you'll prevent suicide from occurring. The claim is that if you're going to kill yourself, you're going to be much more likely to be effective in doing it if you use a gun as other methods. And that's simply false on many different levels. One of the things that I show is that the people in the media and other places who make that claim selectively only pick a few types of ways for people to commit suicide. there are lots of ways that have virtually identical success, quote unquote, success rates for committing suicide. So, for example, taking cyanide, or jumping off a tall building, or stepping in front of a train or a bus or a truck, or hanging oneself, all have fairly similar success rates in terms of suicide success than using a gun. In fact, some of those methods are less painful ways of dying than using a gun are. And it's used for things like red flag laws, because the claim is if somebody is having mental problems, if we can only take away the gun from them, we can prevent a suicide. Red flag laws is something I talk about in the book. I'm not going to go through it much here, but just to go and mention briefly that one of the bizarre things about these red flag laws is that even though it overwhelmingly involves suicide, concerns about people's mental well-being, unlike the protection orders that already exist, they don't involve mental health care professionals in the process. All the states already have a process where if you believe somebody's a danger to themselves or others, they can be seen quickly by a mental health care professional. They can be required within 24 hours or some other short length of time to have a hearing. If they can't afford a lawyer, one is provided for them, and you're frequently talking about costs of $10,000 or so for lawyers in these types of cases. And the thing is, there's a whole range of options for judges to go and deal with there. They can go and provide mandatory care, mental health care for these individuals, or there can be voluntary care where the judge can follow up to make sure that things are working out well there. Judges could take away their guns if they think that that's necessary in that case. The bizarre thing about red flag laws is not only don't they involve mental health care professionals, they don't have a hearing immediately. Judges make a decision to take away somebody's guns based solely on a complaint that's in front of them. There's no questioning of witnesses, no cross-examination. And even when a court hearing may be held, let's say a month later, people who are losing their rights to self-defense have to pay for their own lawyers. That's very costly. And a lot of people may think, look, if the only bad thing that happens to me is that I'm going to lose my right to own a gun, I may want to have a gun, but is it really worth $10,000 for me to go and hire a lawyer to be able to go and do that? A lot of people are going to say, it just doesn't make a lot of sense for them to do it. I think it's probably one of the reasons why these laws are set up the way they are. Anyway, I could go on for a long time about those types of laws, but I wanted to talk about a fourth myth, and that is the claim that background checks stop mass public shootings. It'd be great if there was some magical rule that could go and stop these types of attacks from occurring. But there's a problem, and that is there's not one mass public shooting this century that would have been stopped if such a law had been in effect. You can go and look to see how people obtain their weapons, either legally through a background check or they stole their guns. Neither one involved a private transfer of them obtaining the gun. And so these types of background check rules wouldn't have made any difference. But the irony is that every time you have one of these mass public shootings, usually the first and only law that gun control advocates push for are background checks on the private transfers of guns. I wish the media would once in a while ask these gun control advocates, would it have stopped this particular case? I mean, usually people are calling for it within an hour of these attacks before we even know about what facts were involved. So maybe they couldn't answer that yet. But at least the reporter could then go and say, well, okay, how about other recent attacks, or attacks over the last decade, or attacks over the last 20 years? And the thing is, if they were asked that, they would have to admit that there's none of those cases that would have been stopped, not a single one. The last myth I'm going to talk about here is something that Gun Control Myths spends a good chapter and a half on, and that is the belief that academics think that gun control reduces crime or mass public shootings. And there's a couple surveys that have gotten a great deal of attention in the New York Times. The thing is, they only questioned about 30 academics and a very selective group of people. Not all of them had even done research in the area, any type of empirical research. My guess is they knew what answers those people were going to give before they went and asked them questions. And so what we did was to go with Arthur Berg at Harvard and Gary Mauser at Simon Fraser University, was to go and do the largest survey of academics who have published peer-reviewed empirical research on firearms. But we looked at economists, we looked at criminologists, and we looked at public health people. The surveys that are usually done overwhelmingly look at public health people. And what we found was that there's huge differences in views. Economists and criminologists tend to be very skeptical of gun control. The number one policy that gun control, regarding guns, that criminologists and economists think would be effective in reducing mass public shootings, for example, is getting rid of gun-free zones. Public health people think that's the last thing you should do. They're much more likely to go and say ban guns than they are to go and say get rid of gun-free zones, which ban guns in certain areas. One of the things just to point out is that the government money goes overwhelmingly to public health people. It's one of the reasons why Democrats push for dealing with gun control issues as a public health issue, because that allows them to go and push funding to those people who believe the same types of things that they do. Anyway, I really appreciate your time. I hope that you have found some of this interesting and informative. I hope you'll go to our website at crimeresearch.org. Please sign up for our emails. It's extremely important. We try to put out valuable information on these issues. And please pick up a copy of my new book, Gun Control Myths. You can go and get that at Amazon, or you can get it at Barnes & Noble. Anyway, I greatly appreciate your time, and I greatly appreciate the Gottliebs for again inviting me.
Hello, I'm David Hardy, and I'm a practicing attorney in Tucson, Arizona. In fact, I am not able to make this year's conference because I'm a practicing attorney in Tucson, and a judge dropped a pretrial on top of me. I just wanted to speak on how the Second Amendment came to develop as an individual right. And I know something of this since I was involved in it from the beginning. It's early 1970s, 72, I started to write a law review article. And the theme of it was going to be that gun control does not work as a matter of combating crime. And my editor he said, nice theme, but this is a law review. You should first deal with the legal subject. How about that Second Amendment thing? And I said, because this was the way everybody thought of it in those days in the legal field, there's no there. We all know it's about a state's right to have a militia, a National Guard type thing. And he said, well, write on it anyway. So I went out and researched it and found, well, heck, there's a ton of evidence here that the Second Amendment actually is an individual right. And no one had published a law review article at that point arguing from that standpoint. There were 2 or 3 semi-competent ones arguing that it was just a militia type right. Well, I finally got that article published in 1973. Throughout the 1970s, there were a comparative handful of us who were publishing on it. Most of us were just attorneys, no academics. There was Joyce Malcolm, who was a professor of history, Richard Gardner, Steve Halbrook, of course, a few with David Kaplan, the late David Kaplan, a few others. And early on in its existence, the Second Amendment Foundation, then I think it had only been established 2-3 years, began holding scholars conferences on the Second Amendment. And for the first time, we who were writing in the field could get together, exchange ideas, give presentations to the others, talk about our latest work. It was just invaluable in the days before the internet, when you couldn't just email somebody a PDF file. If you wanted to get to them, you'd have to mail them your entire manuscript, which would be pretty dang thick. So for the first time, we were able to get together and talk. And that's where I met all these people I talked about, Steve Halbrook, Joyce Malcolm, and so on, many, many others. We were publishing mostly in minor law reviews. I mean, today there's about 550 of them now. Back then it was probably a lower number, but still hundreds. The big names in constitutional law can't stop to read all 500 law reviews. They read the big names. And we were publishing in things like Chicago, Kent, Northern Kentucky. I think Joyce got one in Hastings Constitutional Law Quarterly. These were small to middle level reviews. They weren't something the big names were going to read. Then in '83, Don Cates got one in the Michigan Law Review. They summed up all of the evidence we'd uncovered to date. Now, Michigan Law Review might be one of the top 5 in the country. It's certainly in the top 10. It's the type of thing the big names would read. And I know at least one person read it directly and was influenced, and that was Professor Sanford Levinson of Texas. Some years later, he brought out his own article, The Embarrassing Second Amendment, asking why the Second Amendment was given such second-rate treatment compared to the other amendments in academic writing. And he published in Yale Law Review, very big name. With that, it started to slowly roll in the higher academic circles, which I would call the second stage of the Second Amendment. Eventually, all the big names in con law, William Van Alstyne, then of Duke, Akhil Amar of Yale, even Larry Tribe of Harvard, the very liberal writer, they all conceded that, in fact, the Second Amendment is an individual right. Now, Brady campaign and so on still had one defense, which was this. Okay, so you've got all the big names in con law on your side, you still haven't won a case in court. And that marks the transition to the third stage of the Second Amendment's development. A legal team put together impromptu, not with the backing of any major organization, Alan Gura, Robert Levy, Clark Neely, decided to bring a Second Amendment case. And they did it very well. They chose the right circuit, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, which didn't have any Second Amendment precedent. They chose beautiful plaintiffs and chose a very nice legal claim. And they went forward with it. As I recall, they lost in the trial court, then they won in the circuit court. So DC had to take the appeal to the Supreme Court, which radically increases the chances of an appeal being taken. DC did take it, and I went to the oral argument as Alan Gouras spoke against, I forget his name, the attorney for the District of Columbia, but he was formerly with the U.S. Solicitor General's office, so he was first rate. He spoke first, and about a little over 2 minutes into his argument, Justice Kennedy, we all figured whoever got Justice Kennedy would win. The court would split 4-4, and Justice Kennedy would make the majority. Kennedy asked him a question about treating the two halves of the Second Amendment differently. And I realized, I think we win. But the DC attorney didn't catch that. But then about 30 seconds later, Justice Kennedy came out with a really obvious question to the effect of, you're telling me this amendment had nothing to do with the needs of the isolated settler trying to protect his cabin, his family against marauding Indians, bandits, bears. I didn't have the angle, I was in the back of the room, but a friend of mine who was in the front row had a view of the DC advocate's face, and he said the man was trained, but he couldn't hide his body language, his face fell. He realized 2 minutes into my argument, I lost the 5th vote. Of course, then after we won in Haller, they went on and won again in McDonald, established it as a fundamental right applicable to the states. And that's where we are now, 40 years after the movement began. You know, from when I first spoke on this, it was near the battlefield of Kings Mountain, which I had an ancestor in that fight. And essentially what happened there is very much like what happened with the Second Amendment. Namely, the British swept through the over-the-mountain men's area, as they called it, and over-the-mountain men were pretty much neutral in the revolution up to this point. And Major Ferguson sent ahead word that any who do not take an oath of allegiance to the king will be punished with fire and sword. The over-the-mountain men didn't like that. They were Scots-Irish. You don't talk to them like that. Individually, they set out to find this Ferguson fellow and teach him not to talk that way. They knew there was a military unit called a company, and when about 100 of them got together, they would elect a man captain of the company. They had no higher structure at all. No regiment, no brigade, anything. They caught up with Ferguson at Kings Mountain, and they attacked on that basis with no rank higher than a captain, and the captain is just choosing to coordinate all of their men as they went individually up the hill. Like the Second Amendment starting out in the courts and in research, the law reviews, it was a pretty ragged and rugged way to do business. At the end of 2 hours, they took that hill. Anyway, I'd say it's a privilege to be here, but I'm actually not here. But in any event, thank you and have a good one.
Hello, I'm Congressman Don Young from the great state of Alaska, gun owner, NRA board member for many years, a person who believes in the Second Amendment, probably of all the amendments, the most important one. By the way, I'm Dean of the House. I've served longer than any other congressman in Congress, 48 years I'm on. I've served with 9 presidents. I am now the longest serving Republican in the United States Congress in history. So this is a little background, but my other part of it is the Second Amendment. I know you're one of the peoples, the groups of peoples that really want to defend this country. I think that's crucially important. But we're going through strange times. You watch the riots. The people are not being prosecuted, accepted, and we're defunding the police. That's not the America I know. So I'm here to tell you we do have the problem, and we need your votes, just not myself, but other people. And check the backgrounds of those people running for office. Don't let them hoodwink you and say, well, I do support gun rights. Nonsense. If they don't really come down to it, actually sign in blood as far as I'm concerned, that make sure they understand with the Second Amendment, we will have our republic still stabilized. Now, some people say, what are you talking? We know there's been, I think, probably a 40% increase in gun purchases. That's because people are frightened, and they should be. So I'm asking you as a gun right group to understand that your job is going to be out getting everybody, if you can get the record, and everybody gets records, everybody, who's bought a weapon, and asking them not only to vote, but support the right to carry arms, for the Second Amendment, which gives us the right to have freedom of speech and all other amendments. So this is a battle, and I've been involved in it now all these years. I happen to be, they might want to call me one of these people that has too many guns. I don't think that's possible. And that's, my wife says I do, but let's forget that part of it. But I think it's important, I'm a collector, it's important to the future generations that they know that we have the ability to say no to tyranny. And that could happen. I don't want it to happen because we have a group of people in Congress now, really socialists. And one of their first priorities, including my opponent, is to take away our guns. They'll say, oh, we're not going to do that. We're just going to have you registered. Well, maybe that's registered. What's just next? You know, we went through this battle with we call magazines. And I'm saying, we should have a right, if we wish to do so, to have a 30-round clip as far as I'm concerned. Assault weapons. What is an assault weapon? A baseball bat, a knife. Assault weapon is defined in what they're saying. This is an assault weapon. They take them away from you. So definition by government, controlled by those that wish to take away our freedoms is dead wrong. So you're going to have to start thinking about this and get your group out. I don't want anybody complaining and then find out they didn't vote. So again, I'm asking you to do that for myself. My opponent has raised a lot of money, spending a lot of money, and I'm saying we got to beat her and beat that socialist group is running. Keep up the good work, keep the Second Amendment alive, and we'll all take it and be well and good. God bless you all, and God bless Alaska and the United States of America.